Some things in the mountains refuse to stay where they're put. Lost Horse Pass sits at 7,200 feet along the western ridge of Montana's Bitterroot Range, a stretch of granite and lodgepole pine that separates the Bitterroot Valley from the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. The pass takes its name from an 1876 incident in which a prospector's pack train scattered during a lightning storm. 3 horses were never recovered. The terrain is steep but not technical, accessible by Forest Service road from May through October, and largely ignored except by elk hunters and the occasional thru-hiker on the Continental Divide Trail. The Bitterroot Range has always been a place of careful measurement. The mountains form part of the boundary between Montana and Idaho, a line surveyed and resurveyed since territorial days. Elevation benchmarks, property corners, and mineral claims all depend on permanent markers, brass caps set in concrete, stamped with coordinates and dates, designed to outlast the surveyors who place them. In the summer of 1967, a United States Geological Survey team led by field technician Robert Colgren installed 16 such markers along a 2-mile transect of Lost Horse Pass. The markers were standard issue, 4-inch brass discs set 18 inches into bedrock, each stamped with a unique identifier and geodetic data. The installation was part of a regional mapping update, nothing unusual. Colgren's team photographed each marker, recorded its position with theodolite and chain, and moved on. When a follow-up crew returned in 1971 to verify the transect for a new topographic series, they found something wrong. Surveyor Thomas Lindquist was the first to notice. He'd been tasked with remeasuring marker BP 6709 roughly midway along the transect. The brass cap was where it should be, visible, undamaged, stamped with the correct identifier. But when Lindquist set up his equipment and shot angles to nearby reference points, the numbers didn't match. He recalibrated. He checked his notes against Colgren's original documentation. The discrepancy remained. Marker BP 6709 had moved 4.3 feet upslope from its documented position. Lindquist flagged the anomaly and continued down the line. By the end of the week, his crew had remeasured all 16 markers. 14 of them had shifted position. The movements ranged from 2 feet to just over 9 feet. Every single displacement was uphill, following the gradient of the slope. None showed signs of disturbance. No scratches on the brass, no cracking in the surrounding rock, no evidence that the markers had been pulled and reset. The crew filed their report with the regional USGS office in Denver. The response was procedural, possible installation error, frost heave, or localized ground movement. Lindquist was told to document and continue. No further action was recommended. In 1976, a third survey team was dispatched to Lost Horse Pass. This crew was led by Barbara Ortega, a senior cartographer with 11 years of fieldwork across the Rockies. Ortega had reviewed both previous reports and found the discrepancies unusual enough to merit a closer look. Her team carried updated equipment, electronic distance measurement devices, more precise than the chain and theodolite methods of earlier years. The results were worse. 12 of the 16 markers had moved again. Marker BP 6709, which had shifted 4.3 feet between 1967 and 71, had moved another 6.8 feet upslope. Marker BP 67-14, near the ridgeline, had traveled 11 feet since its original installation. Ortega's team spent 3 days rechecking their measurements, cross-referencing with satellite positioning where available. The data held. Ortega later told a colleague, off the record, that the brass caps looked pristine. She described them as appearing unbothered, still seated firmly in their concrete collars, no sign of leverage marks or tool contact. The bedrock beneath showed no fracturing, no frost wedges, no evidence of any force capable of moving several pounds of brass and concrete uphill through solid granite. When asked what she thought had happened, Ortega said only that she didn't know. She described standing on the ridge at dusk, looking down the transect line, and feeling a creeping discomfort she couldn't name. The air was still. The light was fading. The markers were just there, 16 brass points catching the last sun arranged in a line that no longer matched the maps. A forest ranger named Eugene Vickers worked the Lost Horse District from 1973 to 1981. He was familiar with the survey markers, had seen them on his patrols. In a 1998 interview conducted by a graduate student researching land management history, Vickers mentioned the markers in passing. He said they'd been a point of confusion for years among the ranger staff because the positions recorded on official maps never seemed to match what they found in the field. Vickers recalled a conversation with a trail maintenance crew in the late 70s. The crew had been tasked with clearing brush along a survey line and couldn't locate 2 of the markers where the map said they'd be. They eventually found the brass caps 15 and 18 feet upslope from the charted positions. The crew foreman assumed the map was wrong. Vickers filed a discrepancy report with the Forest Service, but no correction was ever issued. When asked if he'd ever noticed anything else unusual about the area, Vickers paused. He said the ridge always felt a little off, though he couldn't explain what he meant. He mentioned that compasses sometimes read strangely near the upper markers, a few degrees off from expected. He'd attributed it to local mineral deposits, though no geological survey had identified anything unusual in the rock composition. Vickers also noted that he'd never seen wildlife near the survey line. No deer tracks, no bear scat, no birds nesting in the pines that grew close to the markers. He said it was probably nothing, just the kind of thing you notice after years in the same stretch of country. In 1982, the USGS dispatched a final team to Lost Horse Pass. The crew included geophysicist Martin Dreyer, brought in specifically to investigate potential ground movement. Dreyer set up seismographs, tested for subsurface water flow, and conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys along the transect. He found nothing. No fault lines, no evidence of creep or subsidence, no underground voids. The bedrock was stable, unremarkable granite, consistent with the rest of the Bitterroot Range. Dreyer's team remeasured the markers one last time. The displacement pattern continued. Several markers had moved again, always uphill, always without visible disturbance. Dreyer included the measurements in his report, along with a note that no geological mechanism could account for the observed movement. He recommended removing the markers and re-establishing the transect at a different location. The recommendation was approved. In October of 1982, a crew was sent to extract all 16 markers from Lost Horse Pass. They brought jackhammers, pry bars, and a portable concrete saw. The plan was to cut out each brass cap with its surrounding concrete collar, document the removal, and install a new transect half a mile to the south. The crew removed 15 markers without incident. When they reached the 16th, marker BP 6703, located near a cluster of wind-twisted pines at the ridgeline, they found the brass cap loose in its collar. The concrete around it had cracked in a perfect circle, as if subjected to rotational force. The brass itself was unmarked, still stamped with its original identifier and date. The crew extracted it, packed it with the others, and descended the pass. No new transect was ever installed. The project was quietly shelved. The extracted markers were cataloged and placed in storage at a USGS facility in Montana. Requests to examine them are met with standard administrative delays. The last known photograph of the markers in situ was taken by Barbara Ortega's team in 1976. Lost Horse Pass remains accessible to the public. Hikers occasionally report finding shallow depressions in the bedrock along the western ridge, circular voids roughly 4 inches in diameter, filled with pine needles and dirt. The Forest Service map still shows the old transect line, though the markers themselves are listed as removed. No explanation for their removal appears in any public record. In 2011, a geology graduate student named Aisha Kowalski attempted to locate the original survey documentation for Lost Horse Pass as part of her thesis on land measurement anomalies in the Northern Rockies. She found references to the transect in USGS archives, but no complete file. Several pages of the 1982 report were missing. Kowalski submitted a Freedom of Information request. After 14 months, she received a response stating that some materials related to the Lost Horse survey had been lost during an office relocation in the late 1980s. Robert Kalgren, the surveyor who installed the original markers in 1967, passed away in 2003. His field notebooks were donated to the Montana Historical Society. Among them is a single entry dated August 9, 1967, written after the team completed their work at Lost Horse Pass. The entry was brief. Kalgren noted that the installation went smoothly, weather was clear, and all markers were set to specification. At the bottom of the page, separated from the rest of the text by a horizontal line, he wrote 4 words in pencil: "Something watches the brass." The line was crossed out, but still legible. The tower was decommissioned without explanation, and the recordings were never released. Dome-shaped mountain rises to 8,200 feet in the northern reaches of the Bitterroot National Forest, a solitary peak visible from Highway 93 near the town of Sula, Montana. The fire lookout that once crowned its summit was built in 1938 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, a 14 by 14-foot cabin mounted on a 40-foot steel tower. For 51 years, it served as an early warning station for wildfires across nearly 600 square miles of wilderness. The lookout was staffed seasonally from late May through September, typically by a single ranger working 10-day rotations in near total isolation. The Bitterroot Range has a history of lightning strikes. Summer storms roll in from the Idaho side without warning, bringing dry lightning and erratic winds. Fire lookouts in this country learn to work through electrical storms, monitoring for smoke while thunder echoes across the ridges. Radio communication is essential. The lookouts operate on Forest Service frequencies, maintaining regular check-ins with district headquarters in Hamilton, 28 miles to the east. In 1971, the first anomaly was recorded. Forest Service Ranger Michael Pemberton was stationed at Dome-Shaped Mountain that summer, his second season in a lookout tower. On the evening of July 17th, a thunderstorm moved across the range from the west. Pemberton was monitoring the radio, listening to weather updates from other towers, when his receiver picked up something else. He described it later as voices, multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in what sounded like structured language, but nothing he recognized. The transmission lasted approximately 40 seconds. It came through clearly, as if the source were nearby, but no call sign was given and no identification followed. Pemberton attempted to respond. He received no answer. He switched frequencies, but the voices didn't follow. When he returned to the original channel, they were gone. He noted the incident in his log, describing the transmission as possible foreign broadcast interference, and listing the time and compass bearing from which the signal seemed strongest. 260 degrees, almost due west. The district supervisor reviewed Pemberton's log during a routine inspection in August. He suggested the ranger had picked up a skip signal. Atmospheric conditions during storms can cause radio waves to bounce off the ionosphere, carrying distant transmissions hundreds or thousands of miles. It was unusual, but not unheard of. Pemberton accepted the explanation. He finished the season without further incident. In 1973, Ranger Linda Cosgrove was assigned to Dome-Shaped Mountain. She was experienced, having worked 5 seasons across various lookouts in Montana and Idaho. On August 2nd, during an afternoon thunderstorm, Cosgrove heard the voices. She described them as layered, as if multiple people were speaking simultaneously on the same frequency. The languages. She was certain there were at least 3 distinct languages, were completely unfamiliar. She spoke some Spanish and had studied Russian in college. These were neither. Cosgrove recorded the bearing, 260 degrees. She made a note of the storm's position and the time, 3:47 in the afternoon. The transmission lasted just under a minute. When it ended, the channel returned to normal Forest Service traffic. Cosgrove reported the incident immediately. The response from headquarters was the same. Likely atmospheric skip, nothing to worry about. But Cosgrove wasn't satisfied. She requested access to Pemberton's logs from '71 and found his entry describing the same phenomenon. The overlapping voices, the western bearing, the electrical storm. She asked if anyone had investigated. The answer was no. Over the next 16 years, every ranger stationed at Dome-Shaped Mountain during storm season reported the voices. The accounts were remarkably consistent. The transmissions occurred only during electrical storms. They always came from the west, bearing 260 degrees. The duration varied from 30 seconds to nearly 2 minutes. The languages remained unidentified. Some rangers described them as tonal, others as guttural or rhythmic. None could reproduce the sounds or identify any words. In 1976, Ranger Thomas Dela Cruz made the first audio recording. He'd brought his own cassette recorder to the lookout, intending to document wildlife sounds during his off hours. When the voices came through on July 23rd, he held the recorder's microphone to the radio speaker and captured 41 seconds of transmission. Dela Cruz sent the tape to headquarters with a formal request for analysis. The Forest Service forwarded the tape to a communications specialist in Missoula, who concluded that the recording contained multiple voice patterns, but was too degraded by static and atmospheric interference to allow for linguistic analysis. The specialist noted that the signal strength suggested a local source, not a skip transmission. No further action was recommended. Dela Cruz later told a colleague that he'd kept a copy of the tape. He played it for his wife, who'd studied linguistics in graduate school. She told him the voices followed patterns consistent with human language, prosody, pacing, turn-taking, but the phonemes didn't match any language family she knew. She suggested he send the tape to a university. He never did. The copy disappeared sometime in the early 80s during a movie between ranger stations. In 1980, the Forest Service replaced all radio equipment at Dome-Shaped Mountain. New transmitter, new receiver, new antenna array. The voices continued. In 1983, the equipment was replaced again. The voices continued in 1986. A third replacement. In 1988, a fourth. Each time the same phenomenon persisted, overlapping transmissions in unknown languages occurring during storms, originating from the same bearing. Ranger Patricia Whitmore was stationed at the lookout during the summer of 1987. She was a trained radio operator with military experience and had worked as a telecommunications technician before joining the Forest Service. When she heard the voices on June 19th, she immediately began a systematic analysis. She noted frequency, signal strength, modulation patterns, and duration. She cross-referenced her observations with weather data and radio propagation charts. Whitmore's conclusion was unambiguous. The transmission was local. The signal strength and clarity indicated a source within 50 miles, possibly much closer. She triangulated the bearing using directional equipment and determined that the strongest reception aligned with a remote section of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, roughly 18 miles west of Dome-Shaped Mountain. The area was roadless, trailless, and largely unmapped, a stretch of steep canyons and dense forest accessible only by helicopter or multi-day bushwhack. Whitmore filed a detailed report recommending ground investigation. She included technical data, audio logs, and a proposed search area. The report was forwarded to the regional office in Missoula. 3 months later, she received a brief response. Her observations had been noted, but no investigation was planned. Budget constraints and low priority were cited. Whitmore requested clarification. No further response was provided. In October of 1988, a Forest Service memo circulated through the Bitterroot district offices. The memo announced that dome-shaped mountain lookout would be evaluated for possible decommissioning. Reasons given included structural concerns with the aging tower, advances in satellite-based fire detection, and reduced staffing budgets. No mention was made of the radio anomalies. By March of 1989, the decision was finalized. Dome-shaped mountain lookout was officially decommissioned. The tower was dismantled that summer, and the cabin was removed by helicopter. All equipment was returned to district storage. The site was cleared and marked as a historic location, accessible to hikers but no longer operational. No public statement addressed the voices. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act in the mid-90s seeking audio recordings and ranger logs from dome-shaped mountain were met with partial responses. Some logs were provided, heavily redacted. Audio recordings were listed as lost or degraded beyond recovery. Technical reports, including Whitmore's 1987 analysis, were listed as missing from the archives. Patricia Whitmore left the Forest Service in 1991 and moved to Oregon. In a 2006 interview with a Regional History podcast, she was asked about her time at Dome-Shaped Mountain. She confirmed the voices, described her investigation, and stated clearly that she believed the transmissions were real and originated from within the wilderness. When asked why the Forest Service had closed the tower, she paused before answering. She said she didn't know, but that she'd been told, off the record, not to pursue the matter further. She said the person who told her this had used the word sensitive to describe the situation. She said she'd asked what that meant. She said she never received an answer. In 2013, a group of ham radio enthusiasts in Montana reported picking up unusual transmissions during a severe thunderstorm on July 9th. The signals were described as overlapping voices in unidentified languages, lasting approximately 90 seconds. The operators triangulated the source to a remote area of the Bitterroot Range, west of the former dome-shaped mountain lookout. They posted their findings online and attempted to contact the Forest Service for clarification. They received no response. The tower is gone, but the frequency remains active. On certain summer evenings, when storms roll in from Idaho and lightning splits the sky above the Selway Bitterroot, some listeners still turn their radios west and wait. The maps showed a place that wasn't there. Tin Cup Lake sits at 7,400 feet in a remote basin of the Bitterroot Mountains, accessible only by an 8-mile trail that climbs through lodgepole forest and talus slopes. The lake is small, less than 10 acres, and rarely visited outside of late summer when the snow finally melts from the upper trails. The surrounding country is steep and trackless, a labyrinth of unnamed creeks and granite outcrops that few people bother to explore. There are no maintained campsites, no facilities, and no records of permanent habitation anywhere near the lake. The Forest Service has kept minimal documentation of the area. A survey crew passed through in 1956, noting the lake's coordinates and approximate depth. A fire lookout report from 1968 mentioned smoke visible from a ridge above Tin Cup, but no source was ever located. Beyond that, the basin appears in official records only as a blue dot on topographic maps, a place acknowledged but largely forgotten. In late September of 2003, 3 hikers from Missoula, David Ferraro, Jennifer Huang, and Marcus Okafor, were exploring the ridges above Tin Cup Lake when they noticed a structural anomaly roughly a quarter mile from the shoreline. What appeared at first to be a natural rock formation revealed itself, upon closer approach, as the remains of a cabin. The structure had collapsed inward, its roof caved and walls leaning at sharp angles. The logs were weathered gray, and the site was nearly invisible beneath a tangle of beargrass and huckleberry bushes. Ferraro later described the cabin as small, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, and clearly hand-built, with notched corners and a fieldstone chimney that had partially crumbled. There was no trail leading to it, no clearing, no sign that anyone had ever lived there in any organized way. The door hung loose on leather hinges. Inside, the hikers found scattered debris, rusted cans, a broken lantern, a cast-iron pan, and, stacked in milk crates and cardboard boxes along the back wall, hundreds of sheets of paper. The papers were maps, hand-drawn, meticulously detailed topographic maps. Huang, who had training in geography, was the first to examine them closely. She pulled out a sheet at random and spread it across a flat section of the cabin floor. The map showed terrain rendered in standard cartographic style: contour lines, elevation markers, drainage patterns, ridge crests. The line work was precise, executed in pencil and ink with a steady hand. Symbols denoted features like springs, cliffs, and forested areas. A legend in the lower right corner identified the scale, 1 inch to 1 mile, and included a north arrow. The map looked professional, the kind of thing produced by a trained surveyor. The problem was that the landscape it depicted didn't exist. Huang compared the map to her own topographic sheet of the Tin Cup Lake area. Nothing matched. The ridge lines ran in different directions. The drainages didn't correspond. The elevation profiles showed mountains where there should be valleys, and valleys where the Bitterroot Range rose to over 9,000 feet. She pulled out another map. Same issue. Another. Same. The three hikers spent the next 2 hours examining the contents of the cabin. They found 218 maps in total, most of them rolled and stored in sections divided by what appeared to be geographic regions. Each map covered a distinct area, with edges that aligned to form larger composite sections. Whoever had drawn them had been working systematically, creating a complete atlas of an entire mountain range. But the range didn't exist. Not in Montana. Not anywhere they recognized. The maps were dated. Small notations in the corners indicated years: 1973, 1979, 1985. Some maps carried additional notes in cramped handwriting, observations about weather, vegetation types, animal tracks. One map included a marginal sketch of a bird, labeled with a name Huang didn't recognize. Another noted the presence of bluestone outcrops along a ridgeline, with a comment that they reflected differently in morning light. The hikers found no identification, no name, no personal effects beyond the maps. There was a sleeping bag rotted through, a pair of boots, size 10, soles cracked and curled, a shelf with 3 books, 2 field guides to Rocky Mountain flora, and a water-damaged manual on surveying techniques published in 1968. No journal, no photographs, no indication of who had lived there or why. Ferraro took photographs of several maps using a digital camera. Huang carefully rolled 12 of the maps and placed them in her backpack. The 3 hikers descended to Tin Cup Lake, made camp, and debated what they'd found. Okafor, a structural engineer, noted that the cabin appeared to have been abandoned for at least a decade, maybe longer. The degree of decay suggested exposure to multiple harsh winters. Huang pointed out that the maps themselves were in surprisingly good condition, protected by the boxes and the dry interior of the cabin. Ferraro wondered aloud whether they should report the find to the Forest Service. They decided to wait until they returned to Missoula and could examine the maps more carefully. Once back in the city, Huang contacted a colleague in the University of Montana Geography Department, Dr. Raymond Tomlinson, who agreed to look at the maps. Tomlinson's initial assessment was straightforward. The cartography was excellent. The contour intervals were consistent. The symbology was accurate, and the overall draftsmanship suggested someone with formal training or extensive self-taught skill. But the geography was completely wrong. Tomlinson compared the maps to every available topographic data set for Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. He checked historical maps, geological surveys, and satellite imagery. Nothing matched. He expanded the search to include ranges in Colorado, Utah, and even parts of Canada. Still nothing. The maps depicted terrain that simply did not exist in any known location. He noted something else. The maps included features that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly without direct observation. Drainage patterns followed logical erosion models. Vegetation zones aligned with realistic elevation gradients. The placement of ridges and valleys suggested actual geologic processes: faulting, glaciation, weathering. Whoever drew the maps understood the landscape they were depicting. They had studied it. They had been there. But where was there? Tomlinson suggested contacting the Forest Service. Huang reached out to the Bitterroot National Forest headquarters in Hamilton and filed a report describing the cabin and its contents. She included photographs and offered to return the maps she'd taken. The response was cordial but slow. A district ranger named Alan Sorensen was assigned to follow up. He asked for the coordinates of the cabin and said a crew would investigate when scheduling allowed. 2 months passed. In December of 2003, Sorensen contacted Huang to inform her that a team had hiked to the Tin Cup Lake area and located the cabin. They confirmed the structure was abandoned and in poor condition. They also confirmed that maps were present. However, Sorensen said the maps and all other contents had been removed and were being held by the Forest Service pending further review. He thanked Huang for her report and said she would be contacted if additional information was needed. She never heard from him again. Huang attempted to follow up in early 2004. She called the Hamilton office multiple times and sent written inquiries. Her calls were routed to different departments. Her letters went unanswered. When she finally reached Sorensen by phone in March, he told her the matter had been referred to a regional office and was no longer under his jurisdiction. He could not provide details. He suggested she file a formal Freedom of Information request if she wanted access to the maps. She did. The request was denied. The maps, according to the response letter, were considered cultural resources under federal management and were not available for public review. No further explanation was given. Dr. Tomlinson attempted his own inquiry through academic channels, contacting colleagues in federal land management agencies. He was told, informally, that the maps had been examined by specialists and deemed of uncertain provenance. One contact mentioned that the materials had been transferred to a repository in Denver. Another said they'd heard the maps were destroyed due to mold contamination. The stories didn't align. Ferraro's photographs taken inside the cabin were the only remaining documentation. He posted several images to an online hiking forum in 2000 and 5 asking if anyone recognized the terrain. Responses ranged from curious to dismissive. A few commenters suggested the maps might depict a location in Alaska or the Canadian Rockies. Others speculated they were simply fiction, the work of someone with too much time and a vivid imagination. One commenter, posting under an anonymous username, claimed to have worked for the Forest Service in the Bitterroot district during the 90s. They said they'd heard rumors of a hermit cartographer living somewhere in the high country, but no one had ever confirmed his existence. In 2009, Huang returned to Tin Cup Lake with a group of friends. They hiked to the location where the cabin had stood. The site was empty. The structure had been completely removed. Logs, chimney, foundation stones. Even the milk crates and cardboard boxes were gone. The ground showed no sign of recent disturbance, only the faint depression where the cabin had once rested. The forest had already begun to reclaim the space, new growth filling the gaps. Huang took photographs of the empty site. She compared them to the images from 2003. The changes were striking. It was as if the cabin had never existed. No record of the hermit has ever been found. No missing person report matches the timeline. No family has come forward. The maps remain inaccessible, their current location unknown. Requests for information continue to be denied or redirected. David Ferraro still has the photographs. He keeps them in a folder on his computer, rarely looks at them, but has never deleted them. He says the maps were beautiful. He says they showed mountains he wishes he could visit, trails he would hike if they were real. He says sometimes he dreams about the landscapes, the valleys, the ridgelines, the blue stone outcrops that reflect differently in morning light. He says the dreams feel like memory. Some roads are supposed to end, but they don't remember how. Sleeping Child Road follows Sleeping Child Creek up a narrow drainage on the western slope of the Bitterroot Range, roughly 12 miles south of Hamilton, Montana. The road was originally cut in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps to provide fire access to the upper watershed. It climbs steadily through ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, crossing the creek 3 times before reaching its official terminus at elevation 6,400 feet. A steel gate blocks further vehicular access. A weathered sign identifies the continuation as Trail 313, a footpath leading deeper into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. The Bitterroot Valley has always been a place of incomplete records. Early Forest Service maps are inconsistent, roads and trails appearing and disappearing between editions as if the landscape itself were uncertain. Infrastructure built during the Depression era was often poorly documented, constructed quickly, used briefly, then abandoned as priorities shifted or funding dried up. By the time modern cartography standardized in the 1970s, much of this history had already been forgotten. Sleeping Child Road appears on every map. Its endpoint does not. In June of 1997, a surveyor named Gregory Matsuda was hired by Ravalli County to verify road designations in the southern Bitterroot for an updated transportation plan. Matsuda's task was straightforward: drive every county-maintained road, confirm its length and condition, and reconcile current data with historical records. When he reached Sleeping Child Road, he drove to the gate, noted the mileage, and returned to the county offices in Hamilton to file his report. While cross-referencing his data, Matsuda found something unusual in the archives. County road maintenance logs from 1952 described Sleeping Child Road as extending 14.2 miles from Highway 93 to Sleeping Child Ranger Station. Current maps showed the road ending at 9.5 miles. Matsuda assumed a clerical error. Perhaps the ranger station was accessible by trail beyond the gate, and the logs had conflated road and trail distances. But the logs were specific. They included grading schedules, culvert repairs, and snow removal records for sections of road that, according to modern maps, did not exist. One entry from April 1954 noted that mile marker 12 had been damaged by a falling tree and required replacement. Another from July 1958 recorded a washout at mile 13.8 following spring runoff. Matsuda requested historical maps from the Forest Service. The response took 3 months. When the maps arrived, they confirmed what the logs described. A 1953 Forest Service map clearly showed Sleeping Child Road continuing past the current gate location, climbing another 4.7 miles to a structure labeled SC Ranger Station at elevation 7,200 feet. The road ended there, at the base of a ridgeline. Matsuda compared the historical map to a current topographic sheet. The terrain matched, the drainages, the ridges, the general contours. But the road was gone. The current map showed only Trail 313, a hiking path that diverged from the old road alignment after less than a mile. The ranger station was not marked at all. He decided to investigate on foot. In September of 1997, Matsuda hiked beyond the gate, following Trail 313 for 2 miles before leaving the maintained path to search for remnants of the old road. He found them almost immediately. Sections of graded cut and fill were still visible beneath decades of duff and undergrowth. Rusted culverts poked from creek crossings. At one point, he discovered a concrete mile marker lying on its side, half buried in moss. The number was illegible, but the marker's style matched those used by the Forest Service in the 1940s and 50s. Matsuda continued upslope, following the faint trace of the roadbed. The alignment was obvious once he knew what to look for: a consistent grade, switchbacks carved into the slope, drainage features spaced at regular intervals. After 3 hours of hiking, he reached a small clearing at approximately 7,200 feet elevation. The ground was level, roughly 40 feet square, with a stone fireplace standing alone near the center. No other structures remained. The trees surrounding the clearing were old growth, but the clearing itself was strangely open, as if something had once prevented forest encroachment. Matsuda took photographs and GPS coordinates. He noted the fireplace's construction, mortared riverstone, professionally built, not a casual campfire ring. He searched for other artifacts but found nothing. No foundation remnants, no metal debris, no signage. Just the fireplace and the open ground. When Matsuda filed his report with the Ravalli County, he included his findings and recommended that historical records be updated to reflect the road's original extent. The county supervisor thanked him and said the information would be reviewed. No update was ever made. In 2001, a Hamilton resident named Victoria Pasternak was hiking with her son near Sleeping Child Creek when they encountered a mile marker approximately 2 miles beyond the locked gate. The marker was standard Forest Service issue, green metal post with white lettering, and read Mile 11. Pasternak was confused. According to her map, she was barely past Mile 9. She took a photograph and posted it to a local hiking forum, asking if anyone could explain the discrepancy. Several responses suggested the marker was misplaced or left over from old trail numbering systems. But one commenter, a retired Forest Service employee named Donald Nguyen, stated that he'd seen similar markers along Sleeping Child Road during the 1980s. He said there used to be more of them scattered along the upper drainage, but most had been removed during a signage consolidation project in the early 90s. He couldn't explain why Mile 11 would appear where Mile 9 should be, but he remembered that the old road system had extended farther than current maps indicated. Pasternak returned to the site 3 weeks later to photograph the marker again. It was gone. The post hole remained, a clean circular void in the soil, but the marker itself had been removed. No other signs of disturbance were visible. She contacted the Forest Service to ask if they'd removed it. The ranger she spoke with said he had no record of any maintenance activity in that area. In 2006, a geology graduate student named Isaac Romero was conducting field research on glacial features in the Bitterroot Range. While reviewing historical aerial photographs for his thesis, he came across a series of images taken in 1961 as part of a Forest Service timber survey. The photos covered the Sleeping Child drainage in high detail. Romero noticed a clear linear feature extending from the current gate location up the drainage to a small clearing near the ridgeline. The feature was unmistakably a road, well graded, with visible switchbacks and cut slopes. Romero compared the 1961 images to modern satellite imagery from 2005. The road was gone. The forest canopy was continuous, showing no sign of the linear clearing that had been so obvious 44 years earlier. Romero assumed the road had been deliberately revegetated, a common practice when Forest Service access roads were decommissioned. But the speed of forest recovery seemed unusual. 44 years was barely enough time for trees to fill a roadbed so completely, especially at that elevation. He mentioned his observation to his advisor, who suggested contacting the Forest Service for historical context. Romero sent an inquiry to the Bitterroot National Forest headquarters, including copies of the aerial photos and asking about the road's history. He received a brief reply stating that Sleeping Child Road had always terminated at its current location and that the features visible in the 1961 photos were likely trails or game paths misidentified as roads due to image resolution. Romero found the response unconvincing. The features in the aerial photos were far too regular and extensive to be trails. He filed a Freedom of Information request seeking records related to the road's construction and any subsequent decommissioning. The request was acknowledged but never fulfilled. After 6 months of waiting, Romero moved on to other research. In 2012, Ravalli County began digitizing historical records. A clerk named Alicia Vega was processing road maintenance logs from the 1950s when she noticed repeated references to Sleeping Child Road extending to mile 14 Vega. Cross-checked the entries with current county maps and found the same discrepancy Matsuda had identified 15 years earlier. She flagged the issue for her supervisor, who told her to note it in the digital archive, but not to pursue it further. The supervisor later explained, off the record, that there had been confusion about Sleeping Child Road for years and that the county had decided to accept the Forest Service's position that the road ended at the gate. Vega asked why the old logs were wrong if the Forest Service was right. Her supervisor said the logs weren't necessarily wrong, just that they described a road system that no longer applied. Vega asked what that meant. Her supervisor said he didn't know. Local hunters and hikers continue to report finding mile markers beyond the gate. The reports are infrequent but consistent. Green metal posts, white lettering, numbers that don't match any current trail or road system. Some markers have been photographed. Others disappear before they can be documented. The Forest Service maintains that no official markers exist beyond the gate and that any posts found in the area are either vandalism or remnants of outdated trail systems. Gregory Matsuda retired from surveying in 2015. In a 2019 interview with a regional history podcast, he was asked about his experience on Sleeping Child Road. He confirmed that he'd found clear evidence of a road extending well past the current terminus and that historical records supported its existence. When asked why the road didn't appear on modern maps, he paused before answering. He said he didn't know, but that he'd hiked back to the clearing several times over the years. He said the fireplace was still there, standing alone in the forest. He said he'd never been able to shake the feeling that the clearing was waiting for something, some structure that had been removed, or perhaps had never been built at all. He said the last time he visited, in 2018, he'd found fresh grading marks on the old roadbed, as if someone had recently driven a vehicle up the drainage. The marks extended half a mile beyond the gate before disappearing into dense brush. He said he didn't report it. He said he wasn't sure who to tell. The water remembers something the maps have forgotten. Carlton Lake sits at 7,800 feet in a glacial cirque on the Idaho side of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, accessible only by a 7-mile trail that climbs through burnt timber and scree fields. The lake is roughly 12 acres, fed by snowmelt and a single unnamed creek that trickles down the granite headwall to the east. There are no fish. The water is exceptionally clear, visibility extending 20 feet or more in calm conditions. The lake bed is visible from shore, smooth granite shelving into darkness near the center, where depth soundings taken in 1973 recorded a maximum of 82 feet. The Selway Bitterroot has a history of cold water. Alpine lakes in this elevation range rarely warm above 50 degrees even in midsummer, their temperatures regulated by snowmelt, limited sun exposure, and the thermal mass of surrounding rock. Carlton Lake follows this pattern. Forest Service records from 1981 list the average summer surface temperature as 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Subsequent measurements in 1989 and 1995 confirmed similar readings. The lake is cold, predictably so, and swimmers who venture in rarely stay long. But some sections of Carlton Lake are colder than others, and the cold doesn't stay where it should. In July of 1998, a group of backpackers from Boise camped at Carlton Lake for 2 nights. On the afternoon of July 14th, 3 members of the group, Kenneth Alvarez, Sarah Okonkwo, and Michael Brennan, decided to swim. The day was warm by mountain standards, near 70 degrees, and the lake's surface looked calm. Alvarez entered the water first, wading from the rocky north shore. He described the temperature as cold but tolerable, consistent with what he'd expect from a high-altitude lake. He swam approximately 30 feet from shore, moving parallel to the bank in water roughly 15 feet deep. Then, without warning, the temperature changed. Alvarez later described the sensation as stepping from a cool room into a freezer. The cold was immediate and total, so intense that his muscles seized and he gasped involuntarily, inhaling water. He thrashed backward, regaining warmer water after 3 or 4 strokes. He returned to shore, coughing, visibly shaken. Okonkwo, watching from the bank, asked what had happened. Alvarez struggled to explain. He said the water had gone from cold to freezing in the span of a single arm stroke, as if he'd crossed an invisible boundary. Brennan suggested he'd encountered a thermocline, a layer of colder water beneath the surface. But Alvarez insisted the change had been lateral, not vertical. He'd been swimming at the same depth the entire time. Curious, Okonkwo swam out to investigate. She followed Alvarez's approximate path and encountered the same phenomenon, a sharp, localized drop in temperature, circular in shape, occupying what she estimated as a zone roughly 40 feet across. She described the boundary as distinct, almost tactile, like passing through a membrane. Inside the zone, the water felt near freezing. Outside, it returned to the lake's normal temperature. The group spent the next hour testing the anomaly. They swam around its perimeter, confirming its circular shape. They dove beneath the surface, finding that the cold extended to at least 20 feet depth, possibly deeper. They marked the zone's approximate location relative to landmarks on shore. Brennan, who carried a waterproof thermometer for a research project, took measurements. The lake's ambient temperature read 54 degrees. Inside the zone, the thermometer dropped to 33 degrees, barely above freezing. The group discussed possible explanations. Brennan suggested an underwater spring, though he acknowledged that springs typically create localized currents and wouldn't maintain such a sharp boundary. Okonkwo wondered if a pocket of snowmelt might be trapped beneath the surface, though she couldn't explain how that would persist in July or why it would remain stationary. Alvarez said it felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, as if the cold had intention. They reported the phenomenon to a Forest Service ranger when they returned to the trailhead 3 days later. The ranger thanked them and said she'd pass the information along. No follow-up ever occurred. In August of 2001, a fisheries biologist named Heather Sutherland was conducting a survey of aquatic habitats in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. Carlton Lake was included in her study despite having no fish population, as she wanted baseline data on temperature and chemistry for lakes in that elevation range. Sutherland and her assistant, Luis Mendoza, spent 2 days at the lake taking measurements at various locations and depths. On the second day, while deploying a temperature probe from an inflatable raft, Sutherland encountered the cold zone. The probe, lowered to 15 feet, registered 53 degrees. She moved the raft 10 feet to the west and deployed again. The reading dropped to 34 degrees. She recalibrated the instrument, assuming malfunction. The reading held. She moved the raft in a grid pattern, mapping the temperature variation. The cold zone was circular, approximately 40 feet in diameter, and displaced from the lake's center by roughly 30 feet toward the western shore. Sutherland noted the anomaly in her field report and speculated about potential causes. She considered submerged springs, thermal stratification, or localized upwelling of deeper water. But none of these explanations fit the data. The cold zone was too sharply defined, too isolated, and too cold. Water at 34 degrees should freeze at that elevation and dissolved gas content. It didn't. It remained liquid, stable, and confined. Mendoza, who had grown up in Idaho and spent summers hiking. The Bitterroots mentioned an odd detail. He said his grandfather had told him stories about Carlton Lake, passed down from the Nez Perce who had used the area for seasonal hunting. The stories described the lake as having a place where the water sleeps, a zone that remained frozen even in summer. Mendoza's grandfather had dismissed it as folklore, likely a misremembered description of a snowfield or glacier. But Mendoza wondered if there might be some historical basis for the cold zone. Sutherland filed her report with the Forest Service and submitted a summary to a peer-reviewed journal on limnology. The journal rejected the paper, stating that the observed temperature gradient was inconsistent with known thermal processes and likely resulted from instrument error. Sutherland resubmitted with additional data and calibration records. The paper was rejected again. She eventually published a brief note in a regional wildlife bulletin describing the anomaly without attempting to explain it. In 2007, a wilderness guide named Dmitry Volkov led a group of clients on a week-long backpacking trip through the Selway Bitterroot. They camped at Carlton Lake on July 22nd. Volkov, familiar with the lake from previous trips, mentioned the cold zone to his clients as a local curiosity. He'd encountered it himself in 2004 and had been surprised by its intensity. When the group swam that afternoon, they found the cold zone had moved. Volkov had marked its approximate location on his map during his previous visit, noting landmarks for reference. The zone was now 15 to 20 feet farther west, closer to the shore. The size and intensity appeared unchanged, still circular, still near freezing, still sharply bounded. Volkov took GPS coordinates and updated his map. Over the next 6 years, Volkov returned to Carlton Lake 4 more times. Each visit he measured the cold zone's position. The pattern was consistent. The zone moved westward at a rate of approximately 15 feet per year. By 2013, it was within 30 feet of the western shore, positioned over water roughly 10 feet deep. Volkov contacted Heather Sutherland, whose name he'd found in the Wildlife Bulletin article. He shared his observations and GPS data. Sutherland was intrigued, but had moved on to other projects and lacked funding to return to Carlton Lake. She suggested Volkov contact the University of Idaho's Geology Department. He did. A graduate student expressed interest, but couldn't secure approval for field work in designated wilderness. The research stalled. In 2016, a group of Cold War historians researching declassified military projects stumbled across a reference to Carlton Lake in a 1959 Department of Defense memo. The memo, heavily redacted, mentioned thermal anomaly monitoring at several remote sites in Idaho and Montana. Carlton Lake was listed by name. No additional details were provided, and follow-up documents were either classified or missing from the archive. One of the historians, Dr. Patricia O'Neill, attempted to learn more through Freedom of Information requests. She received partial responses indicating that some Defense Department activities had occurred in the Selway Bitterroot during the late 1950s and early 60s, including seismic monitoring and geological surveys. The purpose of these activities was not disclosed. What sound? O'Neill found no evidence connecting them directly to the temperature anomaly, but the timing was suggestive. The cold zone was first documented in 1998, but how long it had existed before that remained unknown. In 2019, Dmitry Volkov made his last recorded visit to Carlton Lake. He measured the cold zone's position and found it had continued its westward migration. It now occupied water less than 5 feet deep, barely 30 feet from the shoreline. Volkov noted that the zone's intensity seemed unchanged despite the shallower depth. He also observed something new. Small stones scattered within the cold zone appeared covered in a thin layer of ice, even though the surrounding lake bed showed no such formation. Volkov took photographs and water samples. He planned to return the following summer with better equipment. In March of 2020, he died in an unrelated climbing accident in the Tetons. His field notes and photographs were donated to the Idaho Historical Society. They remain uncatalogued. Carlton Lake still appears on wilderness maps, marked as a standard alpine lake with no special notations. Hikers camp there regularly during summer months. Some swim. A few encounter the cold zone, now positioned in shallow water along the western shore, and wonder briefly about the cause before moving on. Most assume it's a spring or some quirk of geology. They leave, and the lake returns to silence. The cold continues to move 15 feet per year, patient and unhurried. By current trajectory, it will reach the western shoreline sometime in 2025. What happens when it arrives on land, no one has said. The sound came every Thursday, and then it stopped, and no one could say why. Hamilton sits in the heart of the Bitterroot Valley, a town of 4,500 people, flanked by the Sapphire Mountains to the east and the Bitterroot Range to the west. The valley is wide here, agricultural land stretching between mountain walls, with Bass Creek flowing down from the high country to join the Bitterroot River just south of town. It's quiet country, the kind of place where unusual sounds carry and people notice when patterns emerge in the night. The Bitterroot Valley has a modest history of aviation. A small municipal airport serves the area, primarily handling private planes, forestry aircraft, and the occasional medical transport. Flight traffic is minimal, especially after dark. Commercial routes pass well to the north, following the corridor toward Missoula. Military flights are rare, though Lewis and Clark National Forest to the east occasionally sees low-altitude training exercises. These are announced in advance and logged meticulously. The FAA maintains records of all authorized flight activity in the region, cross-checked with radar data from installations in Missoula and Idaho Falls. But some flights leave no records at all. The first documented report came from a dairy farmer named Russell Kowalski, whose property bordered Bass Creek Road 3 miles southwest of Hamilton. On the night of September 6, 1979, Kowalski was awakened by the sound of an aircraft passing low overhead. He checked his bedside clock, 2:47 in the morning. The sound was distinct. A single-engine propeller plane, moving slowly, the engine pitch steady and deliberate. Kowalski went to the window but saw nothing. The night was overcast, no moon. The sound faded to the north. He thought little of it until the following Thursday, September 13th, when the same sound woke him at the same time. 2:47. Same engine pitch, same direction, same low altitude. Kowalski mentioned it to his neighbor, a man named Ed Callahan, who lived half a mile up the road. Callahan said he'd heard it too. Both nights, same time. Over the following months, more residents reported the flights. The pattern was consistent. Every Thursday, 2:47 in the morning, a single-engine aircraft following what appeared to be an identical route up the Bass Creek drainage. Witnesses described the sound as coming from the southwest, passing directly over the creek and continuing north toward Hamilton before fading. No one reported seeing navigation lights. No one saw the aircraft itself. The sound was all that remained. By early 1980, at least 18 households along Bass Creek Road had documented the flights. Some residents began setting alarms to listen. A schoolteacher named Margaret Delacroix kept a log, noting the date and time of each occurrence. The flights continued without deviation. Every Thursday, 2:47, weather regardless. Delacroix recalled one night in January when a winter storm had grounded all local air traffic. She lay awake, listening. At 2:47, the sound came, muted by snow, but unmistakable. In March of 1980, Russell Kowalski contacted the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office to report the flights. A deputy took his statement and said he'd follow up. 2 weeks later, the deputy called back. He said he'd spoken with the Hamilton Airport manager, who confirmed that no scheduled flights departed or arrived at 2:47 in the morning. The deputy also contacted the FAA regional office in Helena. According to radar records, no aircraft had been detected over Bass Creek during the reported times. The deputy suggested the sound might be coming from a vehicle or machinery, perhaps distorted by the terrain. Kowalski disagreed. He'd spent 30 years farming beneath flight paths. He knew the sound of an aircraft. So did his neighbors. In June of 1980, a pilot named Vincent Tavares, who operated a charter service out of Hamilton, heard about the reports and decided to investigate. Tavares was familiar with the Bass Creek drainage, having flown over it countless times during daylight hours. He reviewed the witness accounts and noted the precision of the flight path, always the same route, always the same time. On the night of June 19th, he drove to a pullout along Bass Creek Road and waited. At 2:47, the sound came. Tavares described it later as a single-engine aircraft, likely a Cessna or Piper, flying at an altitude he estimated between 500 and 800 feet. The engine sounded healthy, well-maintained, operating at cruising power. The sound passed directly overhead, following the creek north. Tavares scanned the sky with binoculars but saw nothing. No lights, no silhouette, no exhaust glow. He listened until the sound faded, then drove to the Hamilton Airport. The tarmac was empty. No planes had departed. The next day, Tavares contacted the FAA directly. He filed a formal report describing the flight and requesting an investigation. The FAA response, received 3 weeks later, stated that no radar contact had been recorded over Bass Creek on June 19th or any other date matching the reported pattern. The letter suggested that atmospheric conditions might cause sound to carry from distant aircraft, creating the illusion of a local flight. Tavares found the explanation inadequate. He'd flown in the Bitterroot for 15 years. He knew how sound behaved in the valley. By 1981, the flights had become a fixture of local conversation. Some residents found them merely curious. Others were unsettled by the regularity and the lack of explanation. A retired Air Force mechanic named Walter Ung, who lived near the mouth of Bass Creek Canyon, began his own investigation. Ung had worked on reconnaissance aircraft during the Vietnam War and understood flight operations. He spent several tatas. Thursday nights recording the sound with a tape recorder, capturing the engine's audio signature. He sent the recordings to a contact at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, asking for analysis. The response was informal and came months later. Ung's contact wrote that the engine sound was consistent with a light, single-engine civilian aircraft, likely a Cessna 172 or similar model. Nothing unusual in the audio suggested military hardware or modified engines. The plane, based on the recording, was flying low and slow, possibly conducting a survey or patrol. But without more information, no definitive identification was possible. Ung shared the analysis with other residents. The findings raised more questions than they answered. If the aircraft was a standard civilian plane, why was it flying so low at night? If it was conducting surveys, why were there no corresponding records or permits? And why did the flights follow such a rigid schedule, repeating every week without fail? In 1982, a journalist named Sandra Mberu from the Rivali Republic wrote a feature article about the flights. She interviewed witnesses, reviewed the FAA correspondence, and contacted multiple aviation authorities. The article was published on April 8th. It included statements from the FAA reiterating that no unauthorized flights had been detected, as well as quotes from local residents describing their experiences. Mberu noted the absence of any official investigation and questioned why such a consistent pattern of reports had not prompted greater scrutiny. The article generated regional attention. Several other Montana newspapers picked up the story. A television station in Missoula sent a crew to Hamilton to film interviews. The coverage prompted additional witnesses to come forward, including residents who had heard the flights but hadn't reported them. The total number of documented reports exceeded 30 households. In response to the media attention, the FAA issued a brief statement in May of 1982. The statement acknowledged the reports but maintained that no radar evidence supported the existence of unauthorized flights over Bass Creek. The statement suggested that residents might be hearing aircraft from nearby areas, distorted by wind patterns or topography. No further investigation was announced. Walter Ung, unsatisfied with the FAA's response, filed a Freedom of Information Act request seeking radar logs and flight records for the Bitterroot Valley during the relevant period. The request was partially granted. Ung received radar data showing routine commercial and private traffic, but the logs contained no entries corresponding to the Thursday night flights. Several pages of the provided documents were redacted, with sections marked as classified or withheld for national security reasons. Ung appealed the redactions. His appeal was denied. The flights continued through 1983. Witnesses reported no deviation in the pattern. Every Thursday, 2:47, the sound passed over Bass Creek. Some residents stopped noticing. Others continued to listen, waiting for a break in the routine that never came. Then, in August of 1984, the flight stopped. The last documented occurrence was on August 9th. The following Thursday, August 16th, the sound did not come, nor did it come on August 23rd or any Thursday thereafter. Residents who had grown accustomed to the weekly flights noticed the absence immediately. Some felt relief. Others felt unease, as if something unresolved had simply moved elsewhere. Russell Kowalski contacted the sheriff's office to report that the flights had ceased. The deputy who took his call said he'd noted in the file but offered no explanation. Kowalski asked if an investigation would follow. The deputy said he didn't know. Vincent Tavares attempted to file another report with the FAA, this time noting the sudden cessation of the flights and requesting information about any operational changes that might explain it. He received no response. Follow-up calls were routed to voicemail. Letters went unanswered. Sandra Mberu wrote a brief follow-up article in October of 1984, noting that the flights had ended and that no official explanation had been provided. The article generated little attention. The story faded from public discussion. In 1997, a graduate student named Jeffrey Park, researching Cold War-era aviation activities for his thesis, came across Mberu's articles in the Rivali Republic archives. Intrigued, he contacted several of the original witnesses, including Walter Eng and Vincent Tavares. Both men confirmed the details of their experiences and expressed continued frustration at the lack of answers. Park attempted to access additional FAA records and military flight logs from the period. Most requests were denied or returned incomplete. Park did uncover one suggestive detail. A declassified document from 1995, released as part of a broader disclosure of Cold War intelligence programs, mentioned aerial monitoring operations conducted in the Northern Rockies during the early 1980s. The document provided no specifics about locations, aircraft, or objectives, but the time frame aligned with the Bass Creek flights. Park attempted to obtain more information through additional FOIA requests. None were successful. Russell Kowalski passed away in 2008. Before his death, he gave an interview to a local history project, recounting his memories of the flights. He said he'd never stopped wondering what they were or why they'd come. He said the sound had been so regular, so precise, that it felt like a message, though he couldn't say what the message meant or who it was meant for. Walter Ung still lives near Bass Creek. He keeps the tape recordings he made in 1981 stored in a box in his garage. He plays them, occasionally listening to the engine's steady drone, the sound that once marked every Thursday night for 5 years. He says he doesn't expect answers anymore. He says some things are designed to be forgotten, but on certain Thursday nights, when the valley is quiet and the wind runs up the creek, some residents still wake at 2:47 and listen to the silence where the sound used to be. Some things count forward, even when no one is watching. Blodgett Canyon cuts deep into the western face of the Bitterroot Range, a glacier-carved gorge that rises from the valley floor near Hamilton, Montana, to alpine basins over 8,000 feet high. The canyon is 12 miles long, narrow and steep-walled, with Blodgett Creek rushing through granite corridors that see sunlight for only a few hours each day. The area has been inhabited intermittently for thousands of years, first by the Salish people, then by trappers and prospectors, and later by homesteaders who attempted to farm the marginal land near the canyon mouth before the Forest Service acquired it in the early 20th century. The Bitterroot Range contains countless archaeological sites, most of them poorly documented or lost entirely to time and vegetation. Rock shelters, hunting blinds, and vision quest sites appear throughout the high country, often discovered by accident and rarely studied in detail. Federal and tribal records are incomplete. Much of what exists in the mountains remains unaccounted for in any official inventory. Blodgett Canyon was mapped and surveyed multiple times between 1910 and 1935, primarily for timber and mineral assessment. In the summer of 1936, a team of archaeologists from the University of Montana, led by Dr. Harold Westing, conducted a survey of indigenous sites along the Bitterroot Front. The team was documenting rock art and stone structures when they encountered something unusual approximately 2 miles up Blodgett Canyon, just beyond the first major waterfall. The site was a clearing, roughly 60 feet in diameter, situated on a bench above the creek. The forest around it was dense lodgepole pine, but the clearing itself was open, covered in low grasses and scattered wildflowers. What drew the team's attention was a ring of stones arranged around the perimeter, 127 stones in total, each approximately the size of a human head, spaced at near-perfect intervals of 18 inches. Dr. Westing's field notes, archived at the University of Montana, describe the stones as water-rounded granite, likely collected from the creek below. Each stone bore a carved mark, a simple tally, cut into the surface with a sharp tool. The tallies ranged from a single mark to 33 marks, arranged in groups of 5 with a diagonal strike through each completed set. The carving style was consistent across all stones, suggesting a single hand or at least a unified system. Westing's team spent 3 days documenting the site. They photographed each stone, recorded its position, and made rubbings of the tally marks. They excavated test pits within the clearing, but found no artifacts, no charcoal, no evidence of habitation or ceremonial use. The soil showed no sign of disturbance beyond natural weathering. Westing noted in his report that the site was enigmatic and, unlike any documented, indigenous structure in the region. The team consulted with Salish elders, hoping to identify cultural context. The elders examined the photographs and site descriptions but could offer no definitive explanation. One elder, whose name was not recorded in Westing's notes, stated that the arrangement did not match traditional practices of the Salish or neighboring tribes. He suggested it might be the work of an early settler, though he acknowledged the location was remote and the purpose unclear. Westing's report, submitted to the university in 1937, concluded that the site was likely a homesteader's landmarker or survey boundary, possibly related to a mining claim. He recommended further investigation, but noted that the site's isolation and lack of artifacts made it a low priority. The report was filed in the university archives and largely forgotten. 58 years passed. In the summer of 1994, a Forest Service archaeologist named Denise Komarov was conducting a survey of historical sites in the Bitterroot National Forest as part of a cultural resources update. Komarov had access to Westing's original reports and maps. Curious about the stone ring site, she decided to locate it and verify whether it still existed. Using Westing's coordinates and descriptions, Komarov hiked into Blodgett Canyon on July 18th. She found the clearing with relative ease. The bench above the creek, the open ground, the dense surrounding forest. The stone ring was intact. All 127 stones remained in position, their spacing unchanged from Westing's 1936 documentation. But the tally marks were different. Komarov photographed each stone and compared the images to Westing's original records. The stones themselves were identical, same shapes, same positions, even the same weathering patterns. But the carved tallies had increased. Stones that bore 5 marks in 1936 now bore 12. Stones with 15 marks now showed 23. The highest count Westing had recorded was 33 marks. Komarov found stones with 58. She spent 2 days redocumenting the site, cross-referencing every stone with Westing's photographs and notes. The discrepancies were consistent. Every single stone showed more tally marks than it had in 1936. The increases varied. Some stones had gained only 3 or 4 marks, others had gained 15 or more. But no stone had fewer marks than Westing's original count. None had been replaced or moved. Komarov's immediate assumption was vandalism. Someone had found the site and added marks to the stones, either as a prank or misguided attempt to enhance the archaeological feature. But several details troubled her. First, the carving style was identical to the original marks. Same tool width, same depth, same spacing. Second, the new marks showed weathering consistent with decades of exposure, not recent carving, fresh cuts in. Granite are sharp-edged and pale. These marks were rounded and darkened, indistinguishable from the older tallies except by count. Komarov contacted Dr. Raymond Takashi, a geologist at Montana State University who specialized in stone weathering and tool mark analysis. Takashi visited the site in August and examined several stones in detail. His assessment was troubling. The tally marks appeared to have been carved at different times, spanning decades. The weathering patterns, mineral deposits in the cuts, and degree of edge rounding all suggested a timeline inconsistent with a single carving event. Some marks appeared to be 60 years old, others looked 30 years old. Some seemed even more recent, though still showing significant age. Takashi could offer no explanation for how this was possible. He stated in his report that the marks were genuine, not painted, not artificially aged, not the result of modern tools. He suggested 2 possibilities. Either multiple individuals had returned to the site over decades to add marks in a manner precisely matching the original style, or the dating methods were somehow unreliable at this location. He acknowledged that neither explanation was satisfactory. Komarov filed her report with the Forest Service and submitted a summary to the Montana Archaeological Society. The response was muted. A few colleagues expressed interest, but most dismissed the findings as either documentation error or elaborate hoax. One reviewer suggested Komarov had misidentified the site and was comparing different stone rings. Komarov insisted she had verified the location multiple times. The stones, the clearing, the surrounding landmarks all matched Westing's original documentation precisely. In 1996, a graduate student named Marcus Oleski attempted to replicate Komarov's findings. He obtained copies of both Westing's and Komarov's documentation and hiked to the site in June. His photographs confirmed the discrepancy. The stones remained in position and the tally counts matched Komarov's 1994 records. Oleski also noted something neither Westing nor Komarov had mentioned: a faint path, barely visible, leading from the stone ring into the forest to the northwest. The path was overgrown and appeared unused, but its directionality was clear. A deliberate route, not a game trail. Oleski followed the path for approximately a quarter mile before it disappeared entirely into thick underbrush and deadfall. He found no destination, no structure, no further artifacts. He returned to the clearing and spent the night camping, hoping to observe the site under different conditions. He reported nothing unusual, no sounds, no lights, no disturbances. At dawn, he re-examined the stones. They appeared unchanged. In 2003, Denise Komarov returned to the site for the first time in 9 years. She brought high-resolution photography equipment and a colleague, Dr. Patricia O'Brien, specialized in indigenous archaeology. The two women documented the site thoroughly over 3 days. The stone ring remained intact. The tally counts had increased again. Stones that showed 58 marks in 1994 now bore 63. Stones with 23 marks now showed 28. The pattern of increase was consistent. Each stone had gained approximately 5 marks over the 9-year interval. Komarov and O'Brien cross-referenced the counts meticulously. The progression was undeniable. O'Brien examined the clearing itself, searching for evidence of regular visitation. She found none. No footpaths beyond the faint trace Oleski had noted. No fire rings, no disturbed soil, no litter or modern artifacts. The clearing appeared untouched except for the stones and their changing marks. Komarov attempted to secure funding for continuous monitoring of the site, installation of motion-activated cameras, regular documentation, controlled access. Her proposals were rejected. The Forest Service stated that the site did not meet criteria for active protection or research funding. Academic institutions expressed skepticism about the phenomenon and declined to support further study. Komarov appealed multiple times. The responses remained consistent: insufficient evidence of significance. In 2011, the Forest Service conducted a cultural resources inventory update for the Blodgett Canyon area. The stone ring site was noted in the inventory, but classified as origin uncertain, significance undetermined. The site coordinates were recorded, but no photographs or detailed documentation were included in the public report. When Komarov requested access to the full inventory files, she was told that some materials were restricted pending further evaluation. Komarov made her last documented visit to the site in 2017. She was 63 years old and retiring from the Forest Service. She hiked into Blodgett Canyon alone, carrying only a camera and notebook. She spent the afternoon photographing the stones and recording tally counts. The progression continued. The highest count she recorded was 81 marks on a single stone. The lowest was 7. The ring remained perfect, undisturbed, counting forward. Komarov left a note in the Forest Service files stating that the site should be monitored regularly and protected from disturbance. She wrote that whatever process was occurring at the stone ring was beyond conventional explanation and warranted serious scientific attention. Her note was filed. No action was taken. The site remains accessible to hikers willing to navigate the rough trail into Blodgett Canyon. A few people visit each year, most unaware of the stone's history. Some notice the ring and the carved marks. Most assume It's an old land survey or settler boundary. They take photographs and move on. The stones continue their count. 5 marks every 9 years, consistent and patient. If the pattern holds, the highest count stone will reach 100 marks sometime around 2052. No one knows what happens then. There is a place where time refuses to be measured. The Continental Divide Trail runs 2,800 miles from Mexico to Canada, crossing some of the most remote terrain in the American West. In Montana, the trail follows the spine of the Bitterroot Range along the Idaho border, threading through wilderness so isolated that hikers can walk for days without seeing another person. The section between Lost Trail Pass and Saddle Mountain is particularly demanding, a 17-mile stretch of alpine ridgeline that climbs above 8,500 feet, exposed to weather and offering no reliable water sources. Lost Trail Pass marks the historical route used by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805 and later by Nez Perce refugees fleeing the U.S. Army in 1877. The pass sits at 7,200 feet, a saddle between peaks where Highway 43 crosses the Montana-Idaho border. From there, the Continental Divide Trail climbs north along a series of ridges and basins, passing through lodgepole forest and alpine meadows before reaching Saddle Mountain at 8,900 feet. The terrain is steep, the trail poorly maintained, and navigation requires careful attention to landmarks and compass bearings. The Bitterroot Range has long been a place of geographic peculiarity. Compasses behave erratically in certain areas, a phenomenon generally attributed to localized mineral deposits or volcanic intrusions. Lightning strikes are frequent during summer storms, leaving scorch marks on exposed trees and occasionally igniting wildfires. The Forest Service maintains minimal infrastructure along this section of trail, a few cairns, occasional blazes on trees, but no signs or shelters. In early September of 2001, 3 through hikers traveling northbound on the Continental Divide Trail encountered something they could not explain. The hikers, Sarah Abernathy, Justin Wolfe, and Rebecca Kaminsky, had started their trek in New Mexico 5 months earlier and were nearing the Canadian border. They were experienced backpackers, well-equipped and accustomed to navigating remote terrain. On September 4th, they left Lost Trail Pass in clear weather, intending to camp near Saddle Mountain that evening. Approximately 6 miles north of the pass, along a section of trail that traversed an open ridge line above treeline, Abernathy noticed her wristwatch had stopped. The watch was a digital model, battery-powered, and had been functioning normally that morning. The display was frozen at 11:32. She tapped the watch and checked the battery compartment. Everything appeared intact, but the watch would not restart. Wolfe checked his own watch, an analog mechanical model, and found it had also stopped, the second hand locked in place. Kaminsky pulled out her GPS unit to verify their position. The device powered on, but displayed an error message. No satellite signal. She moved to higher ground, waited several minutes, and tried again. The error persisted. The 3 hikers discussed possible explanations. They wondered if a solar flare or atmospheric disturbance might be disrupting electronics, though the sky was cloudless and they'd heard no reports of unusual space weather. They continued hiking, assuming the problem would resolve itself once they descended from the ridge. Within a quarter mile, Kaminsky's camera stopped working. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the camera would not power on. Wolfe's phone, which he'd turned off to conserve battery, would not turn back on. Abernathy's compass began spinning erratically, the needle rotating without settling on any direction. The hikers stopped. They were standing on an exposed section of trail, surrounded by low alpine shrubs and scattered granite boulders. The terrain offered no obvious features that might explain the malfunctions. No power lines, no metal structures, no visible sources of interference. Abernathy suggested they mark the location and continue. They built a small cairn beside the trail and noted the approximate position based on their last reliable GPS reading. They hiked another half-mile before their devices began functioning again. Watches restarted. GPS acquired satellite signals. Cameras powered on. The transition was abrupt, as if they'd crossed an invisible boundary. The hikers tested their equipment and found everything operational. They looked back at the trail they'd just traveled. Nothing appeared unusual, just open ridgeline, sparse vegetation, and distant peaks. When they reached a Forest Service ranger station 3 days later, they reported the incident. The ranger listened politely and noted the information in a log. He said other hikers had mentioned similar problems in that area, though he couldn't recall specific details. He suggested the malfunctions were likely due to elevation, temperature fluctuations, or user error. The hikers disagreed, but had no evidence beyond their own experience. Over the following years, more reports emerged. In 2003, a pair of hikers from Oregon documented a similar phenomenon along the same stretch of trail. Their GPS units failed simultaneously, and their watches stopped for approximately 30 minutes before resuming. In 2005, a solo backpacker named Derek Navarro reported that his satellite phone lost signal in a specific area between Lost Trail Pass and Saddle Mountain, despite clear skies and full battery. He marked the location with GPS coordinates before entering the zone and again after exiting. The affected stretch measured approximately half a mile. Navarro posted his experience on a long-distance hiking forum, describing the exact coordinates and asking if anyone else had encountered problems in that area. Several users replied, confirming similar experiences. One hiker mentioned that her digital camera had stopped working as if someone flipped a switch. Another reported that his heart rate monitor flatlined, displaying 0 beats per minute despite his obvious exertion. A third hiker, a geologist named Franklin Kowalczyk, stated he'd attempted to use a handheld magnetometer in the area and found the device unresponsive. In 2007, Kowalczyk returned to the site with more sophisticated equipment. He was accompanied by a colleague, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who specialized in geophysical anomalies. The two researchers hiked to the coordinates reported by Navarro and spent 2 days conducting surveys. They used magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and electromagnetic field detectors. Their findings were puzzling. The equipment functioned normally outside the affected zone, but failed consistently within it. Magnetometers displayed erratic readings or shut down entirely. GPS units lost satellite lock. Even analog instruments behaved strangely. Kowalczyk's compass needle spun continuously, and Tanaka's mechanical watch stopped twice during their time in the zone. The researchers documented the boundaries of the affected area as precisely as possible, finding that it formed an irregular oval roughly half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, oriented northwest to southeast along the ridgeline. Geological samples collected from the zone showed no unusual mineral content. Rock types were consistent with the surrounding Bitterroot range, predominantly granite and metamorphic schist, with no volcanic deposits or metallic ores that might explain magnetic interference. Tanaka noted that the zone's boundaries were sharply defined, with electronic devices failing within a few feet of crossing the perimeter and resuming function just as quickly upon exiting. Kowalczyk and Tanaka submitted their findings to a peer-reviewed geology journal. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the reported phenomena were inconsistent with known geophysical processes and likely resulted from equipment malfunction or sheer error. The researchers resubmitted with additional data and photographs. The paper was rejected again. One reviewer wrote that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the study had not ruled out mundane explanations such as battery failure or atmospheric conditions. In 2009, the Forest Service commissioned a geological survey of the Lost Trail Pass to Saddle Mountain Corridor as part of a wilderness management assessment. The survey team, contracted through the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, was tasked with mapping rock types, identifying potential hazards, and documenting any unusual features. The team's report, completed in 2010, made no mention of electronic malfunctions or magnetic anomalies. When Franklin Kowalczyk requested a copy of the full report, he found that several sections had been redacted, including a chapter titled Site-Specific Electromagnetic Observations. Kowalczyk filed a Freedom of Information Act request, seeking the unredacted report. The request was acknowledged but never fulfilled. After 2 years of follow-up inquiries, he received a letter stating that certain portions of the survey were classified as pre-decisional and exempt from public disclosure. No further explanation was provided. In 2013, a wilderness guide named Omar Reyes led a group of clients along the Continental Divide Trail. Reyes was familiar with the static zone, having encountered it himself on previous trips. He warned his clients in advance that their electronics might malfunction in a specific area and advised them to rely on map and compass. When the group reached the zone, all electronic devices failed as expected. Watches stopped. GPS units froze. One client's digital camera emitted a high-pitched whine before shutting down completely. Reyes noted something new. The boundaries of the zone had shifted. Based on his previous visits, the affected area had been centered approximately a quarter-mile north of where the group now experienced malfunctions. He marked the new boundaries with GPS coordinates taken just outside the zone and later compared them to his earlier data. The zone had moved roughly 800 feet to the south over the course of 7 years. Reyes reported his observations to the Forest Service. He received no response. He contacted Franklin Kowalczyk, who was intrigued by the possibility of a moving anomaly. Kowalczyk planned to return to the site in 2014, but was unable to secure funding or institutional support for the trip. He eventually abandoned the project, citing professional pressures and lack of academic interest. In 2016, the Forest Service removed trail markers from the section of the Continental Divide Trail that passed through the static zone. Cairns were dismantled, tree blazes were painted over, and a small section of trail was rerouted to bypass the area entirely. The changes were made without public notice or explanation. Hikers who had used the trail in previous years found themselves disoriented, unable to locate the familiar route. When questioned, a Forest Service spokesperson stated that the markers had been removed as part of routine trail maintenance and that the reroute was intended to reduce erosion and protect sensitive alpine vegetation. The spokesperson made no mention of electronic malfunctions or geophysical anomalies. Follow-up questions were referred to the regional office, which declined to comment further. Local outfitters and wilderness guides noticed the changes. Several contacted the Forest Service to request clarification, noting that the reroute made navigation more difficult and potentially dangerous for inexperienced hikers. The requests were acknowledged but not addressed. One guide, who spoke on condition of anonymity, stated that a Forest Service ranger had told her off the record that the reroute was implemented to discourage people from spending time in that area. When she asked why, the ranger declined to elaborate. Hikers continue to pass through the static zone, though fewer than before due to the rerouted trail. Those who venture into the area still report electronic malfunctions, watches that stop, GPS units that fail, cameras that refuse to function. The phenomenon persists, consistent and unexplained. Some hikers avoid the area entirely, warned by online forums and word of mouth. Others seek it out deliberately, curious to experience the anomaly firsthand. The zone remains unmarked on official maps. Its boundaries are known only through crowdsourced data and personal accounts. The Forest Service maintains that no unusual conditions exist in the area and that all reports of electronic malfunctions are coincidental or the result of environmental factors. Franklin Kowalczyk retired from geological research in 2019. In a final interview, he stated that the static zone represented one of the most compelling unexplained phenomena he had encountered in his career. He said he believed the zone was real, that its effects were measurable, and that institutional reluctance to investigate suggested something more than simple scientific skepticism. He said he didn't know what the zone was or what caused it, but that it was moving, slowly and deliberately, down the ridge toward lower elevations. He said if the pattern continued, the zone would reach Lost Trail Pass sometime around 2035. He said he hoped someone would be there to document it. Some work gets done in the hours no one remembers. Sweathouse Creek drains a remote watershed on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, roughly 15 miles southwest of Darby, Montana. The creek takes its name from a traditional Salish sweat lodge site located near its confluence with the West Fork of the Bitterroot River, a place used for purification ceremonies until the late 19th century. The surrounding forest is dense, old-growth ponderosa pine mixed with Douglas fir and lodgepole, some trees exceeding 300 years in age. Logging operations in the area date back to the early 1900s, though much of the drainage remained roadless and lightly harvested until the 1960s. The Bitterroot National Forest maintained active timber sales throughout the 1970s, part of an aggressive federal policy to increase domestic lumber production. Sweathouse Creek was designated for selective harvest in 1972. Targeting mature ponderosa stands accessible by recently constructed logging roads. The work was contracted to Bitterroot Timber Company, a regional outfit based in Hamilton that employed seasonal crews for cutting, skidding, and transport operations. In October of 1973, a 7-man crew led by foreman Gerald Hutchins was assigned to a cutting block approximately 3 miles up Sweathouse Creek. The site was marked by Forest Service silviculturists, with individual trees tagged for removal based on age, health, and stand density. The crew's task was straightforward: fell the tagged trees, limb them, buck them into manageable lengths, and stack the logs for pickup by skidder. The work was scheduled to take 4 to 5 days. On the morning of October 9th, the crew arrived at the worksite shortly after dawn. They parked their trucks at the end of the logging road and walked the final quarter mile to the cutting block, carrying chainsaws, fuel, wedges, and hand tools. When they reached the site, they found the work already done. A quarter-acre section of forest had been cleared. 23 ponderosa pines, every tree marked for harvest, had been felled, limbed, and bucked into 16-foot sections. The logs were stacked in 3 neat piles along the edge of the cutting block, ready for transport. Stumps were flush cut at ground level. Branches had been removed and piled separately for disposal. The work was thorough, professional, and completed to the exact specifications outlined in the logging contract. Gerald Hutchins walked the site in silence. His crew followed, examining the logs, the stumps, the stacked brush. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, one of the crew members, a sawyer named Raymond Delgado, asked who had done the work. Hutchins had no answer. The crew had been together the previous day, working a different site 10 miles south. No other crews were operating in the Sweathouse Creek drainage. The Forest Service had only one other active contract in the area located 6 miles to the north. Hutchins inspected the tool marks on the logs. The chainsaw cuts were clean, consistent with the steel and Husqvarna models his crew used. The bucking patterns matched standard industry practice: smooth faces, minimal tear-out, proper kerf spacing. He examined a stump and found bar oil residue still tacky to the touch, suggesting the work had been done recently, possibly within the last 12 to 24 hours. The crew checked their equipment. All saws were accounted for, sitting in the trucks where they'd been left the previous evening. Fuel cans were full. No tools were missing. Hutchins radioed the company office in Hamilton and reported the situation. The dispatcher was confused, asked him to repeat. Hutchins explained again. The cutting block was finished, but his crew hadn't done the work. The dispatcher said he'd call back. Hutchins told his crew to wait. They stood in the clearing, surrounded by stumps and stacked logs, trying to understand what had happened. It was Raymond Delgado who mentioned the dream first. He said he'd had a strange experience the night before, not quite a dream, more like a memory that didn't belong. He described standing in the forest, cutting trees in complete silence. No engine noise, no falling timber, no voices. Just the sensation of work being done without sound. He said it felt real, but also distant, as if he were watching himself from outside his own body. Another crew member, Thomas O'Sullivan, said he'd had the same experience. He described it almost identically. Cutting trees in silence, the chainsaw moving through wood without noise, his body working independently of his conscious mind. A third man, Luis Pacheco, nodded. He said he'd thought it was just a dream, but hearing the others describe it made him uncertain. One by one, all 7 men confirmed they'd experienced the same thing. Each described working in the forest during the night, cutting and stacking timber in absolute silence, unable to speak or stop, their movements synchronized and purposeful. None of them remembered going to the work site. None remembered making the decision to work. They simply found themselves there, in the dream or memory, doing the job that now stood completed before them. Gerald Hutchins was a practical man, not given to speculation or superstition. He'd been logging for 22 years, working crews across Montana and Idaho, and had never encountered anything like this. He told his men to sit down and describe their experiences in detail. They compared notes. The accounts were eerily consistent. Same location, same actions, same absence of sound. Several men mentioned feeling cold, even though the night had been mild. One man, a choker setter named Dmitry Volkov, said he remembered the moon being unusually bright, illuminating the forest with a clarity that didn't seem natural. The dispatcher called back. He said the company owner wanted the crew to document everything and return to Hamilton immediately. Hutchins took photographs of the site using a Polaroid camera he kept in his truck. He measured the stumps, counted the logs, and recorded the dimensions of the cutting block. He noted that the work matched the contract specifications exactly. No additional trees felled, no damage to unmarked timber, no deviation from the plan. The crew drove back to Hamilton in silence. When they arrived at the company office, they met with the owner, Frank Sutherland, and recounted their experiences. Sutherland listened without interruption. When they finished, he asked if anyone had been drinking the night before. All 7 men said no. He asked if anyone had a history of sleepwalking or night terrors. Again, no. He asked if they'd noticed anything unusual at the worksite in the days leading up to October 9th. They said the forest had been quiet, fewer birds than normal, no deer sign, an odd stillness, but nothing overtly strange. Sutherland contacted the Forest Service and reported the incident. A district ranger named Alice Pemberton was dispatched to investigate. She visited the Sweathouse Creek site on October 11th and confirmed the crew's account. The cutting block had been harvested according to contract. Tool marks were consistent with commercial logging equipment. No evidence of other crews or individuals was found. Pemberton interviewed the crew members separately, documenting their statements. She noted the consistency of their dream accounts, but offered no explanation. Pemberton's report, filed with the Bitterroot National Forest Supervisor's Office, described the incident as anomalous and recommended follow-up. She noted that the crew's time cards and fuel logs for October 8th showed no unusual activity. All 7 men had clocked out at 5 in the afternoon and logged normal fuel consumption at their assigned work site. There was no record of them returning to Sweathouse Creek that evening. The Forest Service sent a law enforcement officer to investigate possible trespassing or theft of timber. Officer Warren Jameson interviewed the crew, inspected the site, and reviewed company records. He found no evidence of criminal activity. The logs were from trees designated for harvest under a valid contract. No unauthorized cutting had occurred. Jameson noted in his report that the incident was highly unusual but did not constitute a violation of federal regulations. A psychologist named Dr. Helena Kowalski, employed by the logging company's insurance carrier, was brought in to evaluate the crew. She conducted individual interviews and psychological assessments. Her report, completed in November of 1973, stated that all 7 men appeared mentally sound, with no signs of psychosis, dissociation, or fabrication. She noted the remarkable consistency of their dream accounts, but could offer no clinical explanation. She suggested the possibility of shared environmental exposure, carbon monoxide, natural gas, or some other airborne substance that might have caused altered states of consciousness. However, air quality tests conducted at the Sweathouse Creek site found no unusual compounds. Dr. Kowalski's report included one unusual detail. During her interviews, several crew members mentioned a recurring image in their dreams, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them work. The figure was described as humanoid but indistinct, its features obscured by shadow or distance. None of the men felt threatened by the figure. They described it as observant, patient, waiting for the work to be finished. The logging company completed the Sweathouse Creek contract in late October with a different crew assigned to transport the logs. The original crew members returned to work at other sites, but requested not to be sent back to Sweathouse Creek. Bitterroot Timber Company honored the request without comment. In 1974, the Forest Service conducted a follow-up inspection of the Sweathouse Creek drainage as part of routine post-harvest monitoring. The inspection report noted that the October 1973 cutting block showed normal regeneration and no environmental damage. A single line in the report, buried in an appendix, mentioned that anomalous crew behavior had been documented at the site but was not considered relevant to timber management objectives. Gerald Hutchins continued working as a logging foreman until his retirement in 1991. In a 2004 interview with a regional forestry journal, he was asked about memorable incidents from his career. He mentioned the Sweathouse Creek event briefly, describing it as the strangest thing I ever saw in the woods. When asked if he had an explanation, he said he didn't. He said he'd thought about it for 30 years and still couldn't make sense of it. He said all 7 men on that crew remained convinced that they'd done the work themselves, even though none of them could remember doing it. Raymond Delgado, the sawyer who first mentioned the dream, passed away in 2009. His obituary, published in the Rivali Republic, made no mention of the incident. But his daughter, in a private conversation recorded by a local historian, said her father had spoken about Sweathouse Creek only once, years after the event. He told her that he believed he'd been used, that something in the forest had needed the trees cut, and had borrowed his hands to do it. He said it wasn't malicious, just necessary. He said he'd never felt afraid, only confused about why he'd been chosen. The cutting block at Sweathouse Creek has regrown. Ponderosa seedlings planted in 1974 are now mature trees, their crowns forming a new canopy over the site. The Forest Service maintains no permanent markers or records indicating anything unusual occurred there. Logging roads in the area remain accessible, though few. People travel them. The 7 men who worked that crew are mostly gone now. Age, accidents, the ordinary passage of time. Those who remain do not discuss the incident publicly. But on certain October nights, when the moon is bright and the forest is unnaturally still, some residents near Sweathouse Creek report hearing the sound of chainsaws in the distance, steady, rhythmic, working through the night in absolute silence. Some graves hold nothing, and then they disappear. Gibbonsville sits at 5,600 feet in a narrow valley where the North Fork of the Salmon River cuts through the Bitterroot Range, marking the boundary between Montana and Idaho. The town emerged in the 1880s during a brief gold rush when prospectors flooded the remote drainage searching for placer deposits and hard rock veins. At its peak, Gibbonsville housed nearly 2,000 people, miners, merchants, saloon keepers, and families drawn by rumors of easy wealth. The boom lasted less than a decade. By 1900, most of the population had moved on, leaving behind a handful of ranchers and a scattering of abandoned claims. The Bitterroot Range has always been a place of cultural intersection. The Salish, Shoshone-Bannock, and Nez Perce people used the high country for seasonal hunting and plant gathering, following ancient trails across mountain passes. Rock cairns, vision quest sites, and other stone structures appear throughout the range, marking trails, commemorating events, or serving ceremonial purposes. Most of these sites were documented poorly or not at all by early settlers, who often misunderstood or ignored their significance. In late August of 1888, a group of prospectors working a claim above Gibbonsville made an unusual discovery approximately 3 miles east of town on a timbered bench overlooking the North Fork drainage. The prospectors, led by a man named Silas Hargrove, were searching for new ore bodies when they came across a clearing roughly 100 feet in diameter. The clearing was ringed by lodgepole pine and appeared deliberately maintained, with low grasses and scattered wildflowers, but no saplings or brush. What drew their attention was a series of stone cairns arranged in 3 concentric circles within the clearing. Hargrove's account, recorded in a letter to his brother in Virginia, dated September 2, 1888, described 43 cairns in total. Each cairn stood approximately 3 feet high and 2 feet in diameter, constructed from river stones stacked without mortar. The stones were water-worn granite and basalt, likely collected from the North Fork, several hundred feet below. The cairns were evenly spaced, forming precise circles with the largest outer ring containing 19 structures, the middle ring containing 15, and the innermost ring containing 9. Hargrove and his companions assumed they'd found a Native American burial ground. Such sites were common throughout the West, and miners typically avoided disturbing them, partly out of respect, partly out of superstition. Hargrove noted in his letter that the cairns appeared old, with moss growing on many of the stones and vegetation established around their bases. He estimated the site might be decades old, possibly older. The prospectors reported their find to the local assay office in Gibbonsville. The assayer, a man named Walter Fitzpatrick, was also the town's informal record keeper and had some interest in local history. Fitzpatrick contacted a surveyor named Preston Morales, who maintained correspondence with the Smithsonian Institution regarding archaeological sites in the Idaho Territory. Morales visited the site in early September and made detailed sketches and measurements. Morales's notes, now archived at the Idaho State Historical Society, described the cairns as unusually regular in construction and arrangement. He noted that the circles were not quite perfect. They showed slight elongation along a north-south axis, but were far more precise than most indigenous stone structures he'd encountered. He also noted something curious. The ground beneath and around the cairns showed no sign of excavation or burial. He probed the soil with a survey rod and found no depressions, no evidence of disturbed earth, no indication that anything had been interred. Puzzled, Morales excavated a test pit near one of the outer cairns, digging down approximately 3 feet. He found undisturbed soil, a few roots, and a layer of decomposed granite consistent with the surrounding geology. No artifacts, no bone, no charcoal, or other signs of human activity. He examined several other cairns and found the same pattern. The structures appeared to mark nothing. In October of 1888, Morales arranged for a delegation of Salish elders to visit the site. The Salish Kootenai Confederation had tribal lands to the north and maintained knowledge of traditional sites throughout the Bitterroot country. 3 elders made the journey. Their names were recorded by Morales as Baptiste Quequesa, Michel Revet, and a woman identified only as Mary. The elders examined the cairns, walked the circles, and discussed the site among themselves in their own language. Their conclusion, as recorded by Morales, was unequivocal. The site was not Salish, nor did it match to any known practice of neighboring tribes. The arrangement of stones, the precision of the circles, and the absence of associated features like fire pits or offering cairns were inconsistent with traditional burial or ceremonial sites. Baptiste Quequesa reportedly stated that the place felt wrong in a way he could not articulate, and suggested that the stones had been placed by someone who did not understand how such structures should be built. The elders also noted that the location itself was unusual. Traditional burial sites were typically placed in prominent locations, on ridgetops, near water sources, or at trail junctions. This site was hidden on a timbered bench, accessible only by climbing through dense forest, with no clear view and no association with travel routes or resource areas. Quequesa said the placement suggested concealment rather than commemoration. Morales documented the elders' observations and sent a report to the Smithsonian. He received no response. In his personal notes, he expressed frustration that the site defied easy classification. He wrote that the cairns appeared ancient but marked nothing, were precisely arranged but culturally unrecognizable, and existed in a location that made no practical or ceremonial sense. Through the winter of 1888 and into the spring of 1889, the cairn site attracted occasional visitors, miners, ranchers, a few curious townspeople from Gibbonsville. Most found the site unremarkable and moved on. A few reported feeling uneasy in the clearing, though they couldn't explain why. One miner, a man named Patrick Donnelly, told the Gibbonsville saloon keeper that he'd visited the cairns at dusk and heard what sounded like stones clicking together, as if the cairns were settling or shifting. When he returned the next morning, he found no evidence of movement. In June of 1889, Preston Morales returned to the site to take additional photographs using a recently acquired camera. He found the cairns unchanged, same positions, same configuration, same moss-covered stones. He took several images, though the quality of early photographic equipment made fine detail difficult to capture. These photographs, now held by the Idaho State Historical Society, show the clearing and the general arrangement of cairns, though individual structures are difficult to distinguish. By the fall of 1889, interest in the site had waned. Gibbonsville's mining boom was fading, and people were more concerned with economic survival than archaeological curiosities. Morales moved to Boise for surveying work and did not visit the site again. In April of 1891, a rancher named Elijah Kowalski was riding through the timber east of Gibbonsville, checking fence lines when he passed near the cairn site. He had visited the location once before, in 1889, and remembered the clearing's approximate position. When he rode into the area, he found the clearing easily enough, the open ground, the pine border, the bench overlooking the valley. But the cairns were gone. All 43 structures had vanished. No stones remained in the circles. No collapse, no scatter, no evidence of deliberate removal. The ground where the cairns had stood showed only grass and soil. Kowalski dismounted and walked the clearing, searching for any trace of the structures. He found none. The clearing was empty. Kowalski reported what he'd seen to Walter Fitzpatrick at the assay office. Fitzpatrick was skeptical. He suggested that Kowalski had misremembered the location or that the cairns had been removed by someone, perhaps miners salvaging stone for another purpose. Kowalski insisted he had the right location. He recognized landmarks, the view down to the valley, the specific trees at the clearing's edge. Fitzpatrick made a note of the report but took no further action. In July of 1891, Preston Morales learned of Kowalski's account through correspondence with Fitzpatrick. Morales traveled from Boise to Gibbonsville and hiked to the cairn site. He confirmed that the clearing existed, that its position matched his survey records, and that the cairns were absent. He found no stone debris, no collapsed structures, no indication of where the stones might have gone. Each of the 43 cairn locations, marked on his original survey map, showed only a circular patch of dead grass, approximately 2 feet in diameter, where vegetation had died back to bare soil. Morales documented the dead grass circles with photographs and measurements. The circles matched the original cairn positions exactly. He excavated several test pits, searching for buried stones or evidence of removal. He found nothing. The soil was undisturbed, the same depth and composition as his original 1888 excavations. It was as if the cairns had never existed, except for the dead grass that marked where they had been. Morales wrote to the Smithsonian again, describing the disappearance and including photographs. This time he received a brief response from an assistant curator stating that stone structures were sometimes dismantled by settlers for building materials and that the dead grass was likely coincidental, perhaps caused by localized drought or soil chemistry. The curator thanked Morales for his interest but suggested that the matter required no further investigation. Morales attempted to interest local newspapers in the story. The Idaho County Free Press published a short article in August of 1891 under the headline, "Mysterious Stone Circles Vanish Near Gibbonsville." The article summarized the discovery and disappearance but offered no explanations. It generated no follow-up stories or public interest. In 1892, Morales made a final visit to the site. The dead grass circles were still present, now more pronounced, with the soil appearing almost scorched despite adequate rainfall. He photographed the circles and noted their persistence. He also observed that wildlife seemed to avoid the clearing. No deer tracks, no elk droppings, no bird nests in the surrounding trees. The clearing was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Morales's final report, dated September 1892, concluded with a statement that he could not explain the cairn's disappearance and that the site represented an enigma beyond current archaeological understanding. He recommended that the clearing be monitored periodically to determine whether the dead grass circles persisted or expanded. No such monitoring was ever conducted. The cairn site faded from historical record. Gibbonsville's population continued to decline, and by 1910 the town was nearly abandoned. The Forest Service acquired much of the surrounding land, and the area was incorporated into what would eventually become the Salmon Chalice National Forest. Modern topographic maps show the bench where the clearing once stood, but no markers or trails indicate anything unusual about the location. In 1973, a Forest Service archaeologist named Dr. Amanda Rojas conducted a survey of historical sites in the North Fork drainage. She reviewed Preston Morales's reports and attempted to locate the cairn site using his original coordinates and descriptions. She found the bench and identified what appeared to be the clearing, though by that time the forest had encroached significantly, reducing the open area. She found no dead grass circles, no stone remnants, no evidence of the cairns. The ground appeared undisturbed and unremarkable. Rojas noted in her report that the site's cultural affiliation remained unknown and that no physical evidence supported the existence of the cairns beyond Morales's photographs and written accounts. She classified the site as unverified historical feature and recommended no further action. The photographs taken by Preston Morales in 1889 remain in the Idaho State Historical Society archives. They show a clearing, some trees, and what might be stone structures, though the image quality makes definitive identification difficult. The photographs from 1891 showing the empty clearing and the dead grass circles are clearer, but no less puzzling. No one knows what the cairns marked, who built them, or why they disappeared. No similar structures have been found elsewhere in the Bitterroot Range. The dead grass circles persisted for at least a year after the cairns vanished, but their current status is unknown. The clearing, if it still exists, remains accessible, but unnamed and unvisited. The Salish elders who examined the site in 1888 left no written record of their own thoughts beyond what Morales documented. Their descendants, when asked in recent years, have no oral tradition or knowledge of the cairns. The site exists now only in archival documents, survey notes, faded photographs, a handful of letters, testimony to something that was briefly visible and then erased, leaving nothing but questions and circles where grass refused to grow. Some mountains keep appointments no one scheduled. Trapper Peak rises to 10,157 feet at the southern end of the Bitterroot Range, the highest point in Ravalli County, Montana. The mountain dominates the skyline above the town of Darby, visible for miles across the Bitterroot Valley. Its north face is a dramatic sweep of granite and scree, heavily timbered at lower elevations, rising to alpine tundra and permanent snowfields near the summit. The peak was named in the 1860s for fur trappers who worked the surrounding drainages, though indigenous Salish people knew it by another name, now largely forgotten. The Bitterroot Range experiences heavy winter snowfall, with accumulations at high elevations often exceeding 15 feet. Avalanche activity is common, driven by steep terrain, variable snowpack, and temperature fluctuations. The Forest Service maintains avalanche forecasts for popular backcountry areas, rating slopes by danger level and recommending closures when conditions warrant. Trapper Peak's north face has always been considered high-risk terrain, steep enough to slide, exposed to prevailing winds, and prone to slab formation. But avalanches, for all their apparent randomness, follow patterns. They occur when snowpack structure fails, triggered by loading, temperature change, or mechanical stress. They do not occur on schedule. On February 19, 1982, an avalanche swept the north face of Trapper Peak at 3:14 in the afternoon. The slide originated near 8,500 feet elevation, fracturing across a slope approximately 300 feet wide. The debris path descended nearly 2,000 vertical feet, stripping vegetation and depositing a fan of snow and broken timber at the base of the face. No one witnessed the avalanche directly, but several residents of Darby reported hearing a deep rumble that afternoon, followed by a plume of snow visible against the mountain. The avalanche was documented by Forest Service personnel conducting routine snow surveys in the area. Avalanche forecaster Martin Vasquez visited the site 2 days later and recorded the slide's dimensions, estimated volume, and crown fracture characteristics. His report, filed with the Bitterroot National Forest, noted that snowpack conditions on February 19th had been moderately unstable. A recent loading event had deposited 8 inches of new snow on a weak faceted layer. The avalanche was classified as a natural release, unremarkable in the context of winter conditions that year. Vasquez's report included GPS coordinates for the avalanche crown and detailed photographs of the fracture line. He noted the exact time of the slide, 3:14 p.m., based on seismograph data from a University of Montana monitoring station 30 miles away. Avalanche generates seismic signals detectable at distance, and the station's records showed a distinct event corresponding to the Trapper Peak slide. 5-year past. On February 19, 1987, an avalanche struck Trapper Peak's north face at 3:14 in the afternoon. The slide originated at the same elevation, fractured across the same slope, and followed the same debris path as the 1982 event. Forest Service personnel, alerted by seismograph data, visited the site within days. The avalanche's characteristics were nearly identical to the previous slide. Same crown width, same vertical descent, same deposition pattern. This time, Martin Vasquez took particular note. He had been the forecaster in 1982 and recognized the location immediately. He compared his field notes and photographs from both events. The similarities were striking, but not impossible. Avalanche paths often repeat, following the same terrain features and weak points in the snowpack. Vasquez documented the coincidence in his report, but offered no further comment. What troubled him was the snowpack. February 1987 had been a light snow year. The high country carried less than 60% of normal accumulation, and stability tests conducted days before the avalanche showed strong, well-bonded layers. Conditions were not conducive to natural releases. Yet the slide had occurred at the same time in the same place with the same force as the event 5 years earlier. 5 more years. February 19, 1992, 3:14 in the afternoon. The same slope on Trapper Peak released again. This time the avalanche was witnessed by 2 cross-country skiers, Derek Okafor and Linda Moreau, who were traveling through the valley below. They reported hearing a crack, looking up to see the crown fracture, and watching the slide descend the face in a massive cloud of powder. They estimated the duration at 45 seconds. When the air cleared, the debris field stretched across the valley floor, blocking a Forest Service road and burying several acres of timber. Okafor and Moreau reported the avalanche to the Forest Service that evening. Martin Vasquez, now a senior forecaster, was assigned to investigate. When he arrived at the site the following day and confirmed the location, he felt a growing unease. 3 avalanches, same date, same time, same place, across 10 years. He pulled records for the previous events and laid out the data. Crown elevations within 50 feet of each other. Debris paths nearly identical. Seismic signatures showing peak energy release at 3:14 p.m. Vasquez expanded his research. He reviewed avalanche records for Trapper Peak dating back to the 1960s. He found dozens of documented slides on the north face, scattered across winter months, occurring at various times and locations. None repeated with this precision. He examined snowpack data for all 3 February 19ths. The conditions were different each time. 1982 had been a heavy snow year with unstable layers, 87 had been light and stable. 1992 fell somewhere in between. There was no common meteorological thread. Vasquez consulted with colleagues at the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center and the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. He presented the data without interpretation, asking if such a pattern could occur naturally. The responses were cautious. Avalanche paths do repeat, and timing coincidences are possible, but the precision described, same date, same time, across multiple years with varying conditions, was statistically improbable. One forecaster suggested instrumental error in the seismograph timing. Vasquez verified the equipment. It was functioning correctly and had been recalibrated between events. In his 1992 report, Vasquez included a section titled Recurring Avalanche Pattern. He outlined the 3 events, noted the temporal and spatial precision, and stated that no existing avalanche forecasting model could account for the pattern. He recommended continuous monitoring of the slope and suggested that the area be evaluated for possible closure to public access. The report was filed with the Bitterroot National Forest Supervisor's Office. No response was issued. February 19, 1997. Martin Vasquez was no longer working as an avalanche forecaster. He had transitioned to a desk position in Missoula, but he had marked the date on his calendar. At 3:14 in the afternoon, he was sitting in his office when a colleague knocked on his door. The University of Montana seismograph had just recorded an avalanche on Trapper Peak. Vasquez drove to Darby that evening and reached the mountain the following morning. The slide had occurred exactly as before. Same slope, same crown, same path. He stood at the base of the debris field and felt a cold certainty settle over him. This was not coincidence. This was something else. He spent 3 days documenting the site, taking measurements, photographs, and snow samples. He interviewed residents of Darby, asking if anyone had been near the mountain on February 19th. A rancher named Patricia Delgado said she'd been working in her barn that afternoon and heard the avalanche. She checked her watch when she heard the rumble. 3:14. Vasquez wrote a detailed report, longer and more insistent than his previous filings. He included statistical analysis showing that the probability of 4 avalanches occurring on the same date, at the same time, in the same location across 15 years was astronomically low, effectively impossible under natural conditions. He recommended immediate closure of the area and proposed installing monitoring equipment to record conditions on future February 19th. He sent the report to the Forest Service Regional Office in Missoula and copied it to the National Avalanche Center. The response came 6 weeks later. A Forest Service administrator thanked Vasquez for his diligence and stated that his observations had been noted. The administrator wrote that avalanche occurrence was inherently chaotic and that patterns could emerge from random processes. No further action was recommended. Vasquez requested a meeting to discuss the matter. His request was denied. 5 more years. February 19, 2002. Vasquez was retired by then, living in Hamilton, but he couldn't stop thinking about Trapper Peak. He drove to Darby on the morning of the 19th and parked at a Forest Service trailhead with a view of the north face. He brought binoculars, a camera, and a handheld radio tuned to avalanche forecasting frequencies. The day was cold and clear, snowpack thin after a dry winter. At 3:14 p.m., the mountain released. Vasquez watched through binoculars as the crown fractured, the slope collapsed, and the debris poured down the familiar path. He photographed the event and recorded audio of the rumble. When it was over, he sat in his truck and stared at the mountain. He drove to the Forest Service office in Darby the next day and filed a final report, unsolicited and unofficial. He described the 5th avalanche, included his photographs and observations, and stated plainly that the pattern was beyond natural explanation. He wrote that something about Trapper Peak's north face, some geological, atmospheric, or unknown factor, was causing regular, predictable failures on a fixed schedule. He urged immediate investigation. The Forest Service never replied. Vasquez kept a copy of his report and waited for February 19, 2007. When the date approached, he drove to Darby again and watched the mountain. 3:14 came and went. No avalanche occurred, nor did one occur in 2012, 2017, or 2022. The pattern had stopped. In 2003, the Forest Service issued a closure order for the north face of Trapper Peak, effective year-round. The order cited unstable terrain and high avalanche risk, but provided no specific incidents or data to justify the closure. The area had been open to backcountry recreation for decades, and local guides and skiers protested the decision. The Forest Service declined to provide additional explanation. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act seeking avalanche records and closure justification documents were partially granted. Some reports were provided, heavily redacted. Others were listed as missing or archived in locations that could not be accessed. Martin Vasquez's 1997 report, which included his statistical analysis and closure recommendation, was not among the released documents. In 2009, a graduate student named Christopher Navarro, researching avalanche patterns in the Northern Rockies, discovered references to the Trapper Peak events in archived Forest Service files. He contacted Vasquez, who was by then 71 years old and living in Stevensville. Vasquez shared his reports, photographs, and personal observations. Navarro attempted to publish a paper on the phenomenon. The paper was rejected by multiple journals, with reviewers stating that the data were insufficiently rigorous or that the pattern could be explained by observer bias and selective reporting. Navarro visited the Trapper Peak site in 2010. The closure was still in effect, marked by signs warning of avalanche danger. He hiked to the base of the north face and examined the terrain. He found old debris from previous slides, timber scarring, and deposition patterns consistent with repeated avalanches. He also found something unusual, a series of survey markers embedded in the rock at the base of the slide path. The markers were weathered but appeared official, stamped with dates ranging from 1983 to 2001. Navarro photographed the markers and noted their positions. He could find no record of who had placed them or what they were surveying. Martin Vasquez passed away in 2018. His obituary in the Raleigh Republic made no mention of Trapper Peak or the repeating avalanche. Among his personal effects, his family found a box of documents related to the phenomenon, reports, photographs, maps, and a handwritten note dated February 19, 2007. The note read, "It stopped. I don't know if that's better or worse. The north face of Trapper Peak remains closed. The Forest Service has never provided a detailed explanation for the closure, and inquiries are referred to regional offices that decline to comment. The mountain stands above Darby, its north face visible and silent, marked by old slide paths and the absence of winter travelers." On certain February afternoons, when the light angles just right across the Bitterroot Valley, some residents still glance toward Trapper Peak at 3:14 and listen for the sound that used to come. They hear nothing now, and that troubles them more than the avalanches ever did. The images showed a place that almost existed. St. Mary Peak rises to 9,270 feet at the northern end of the Bitterroot Range, a prominent summit visible from the town of Stevensville and the Bitterroot Valley below. The peak is sacred to the Salish people, who called it the place where the mountains meet the sky. A lookout tower once stood near the summit, staffed by the Forest Service from 1938 until 1972, when advances in aerial surveillance rendered it obsolete. The tower was removed in 1974, leaving only a concrete foundation and a spectacular 360-degree view. The trail to St. Mary Peak is well maintained, a 7-mile climb through ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, eventually breaking above tree line into alpine meadows and exposed rock. The route is popular with day hikers during summer months, and the summit registers hundreds of visitors each year. The terrain is rugged but familiar, documented in countless photographs, guidebooks, and topographic maps. On September 12, 2009, a hiker named Julia Kaplan was descending from St. Mary Peak when she noticed something unusual, approximately a quarter-mile below the summit, just off the main trail. A camera case lay partially concealed beneath a boulder, wedged into a crevice where it had been protected from direct weather exposure. The case was canvas, badly weathered, with metal clasps corroded by years of moisture and temperature cycles. Kaplan, an amateur photographer herself, was curious. She retrieved the case and opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in a deteriorating leather pouch, was a camera, a Pentax K1000, a manual SLR model popular in the 1970s and 80s. The camera body was intact but showed significant wear. The lens was scratched but not shattered. Most remarkably, the camera still contained film. The frame counter showed 36 exposures, all used. The film door was closed and intact, suggesting the roll had never been developed. Kaplan took the camera case and its contents back to Stevensville. She was uncertain what to do with it. The camera was old, the film likely ruined by years of exposure to temperature fluctuations and humidity. But something about the find intrigued her. She contacted a local photography shop, Bitterroot Camera, and asked if the film might still be viable. The shop owner, Dennis Wolf, was skeptical but willing to try. He explained that film degrades over time, especially under adverse conditions, but occasionally old rolls yield images, often fogged, discolored, or partially blank. He sent the film to a specialty lab in Seattle that dealt with archival and damaged media. The lab agreed to process the roll as a professional courtesy, with no guarantee of results. 6 weeks later, the lab returned a contact sheet and a set of prints. 28 of the 36 exposures had produced images. The quality was poor. Colors were shifted, contrast was low, and several frames showed significant light damage, but the content was visible. The photographs depicted a group of 4 hikers in what appeared to be the Bitterroot Range. 3 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 20s or 30s, dressed in clothing consistent with the 1970s. Bell-bottom jeans, flannel shirts, canvas packs with external frames. The hikers were smiling in several frames, posing at recognizable landmarks, a rocky outcrop, a meadow of wildflowers, a mountain ridge. Dennis Wolfe recognized one of the locations immediately, the summit area of St. Mary Peak. The concrete foundation of the old lookout tower was visible in the background of 2 photographs. But something was wrong. In the images, the tree line extended much higher up the slope than it should. Trees that should have been sparse or absent near the summit appeared dense and mature. The ridge behind the hikers, identifiable by its distinctive granite formations, was oriented differently, as if the camera had been pointed from an angle that didn't exist given the terrain's actual layout. Wolfe called Julia Kaplan and asked her to come look at the prints. She arrived the next day and examined them carefully. She'd hiked St. Mary Peak dozens of times and knew the landmarks well. The photographs showed places she recognized, but the spatial relationships were off. A rock formation that should be southwest of the summit appeared to the north. A drainage that descended east seemed to run west. The elevation of the tree line, easily distinguished by the transition from forest to alpine vegetation, was at least 500 feet higher than it should be. Kaplan and Wolfe discussed possible explanations. Perhaps the photographer had been at a different location that merely resembled St. Mary Peak. But the lookout tower foundation was unmistakable. It appeared in 2 of the frames, complete with the bolt patterns and dimensions consistent with the structure that had stood there until 1974. Perhaps the images had been manipulated or composited, but this was film photography from an era before digital editing, and the prints showed no evidence of double exposure or darkroom trickery. Wolfe made copies of the photographs and contacted a colleague, Rachel Okonkwo, who taught photography at the University of Montana. Okonkwo specialized in film analysis and historical photographic techniques. She examined the prints and the negatives under magnification. Her assessment was cautious but troubling. The film stock, based on its edge markings and emulsion characteristics, appeared to be Kodachrome, a popular color slide film manufactured from 1935 until 2009. The specific variant, based on technical analysis, was likely produced in the mid-1970s. The camera, Pentax K1000, was manufactured between 1976 and 1997. The clothing and dadids. Equipment visible in the photographs were consistent with 1970s hiking gear, but the images themselves defied straightforward interpretation. Okonkwo noted that the lighting, shadow angles, and depth of field were all consistent with outdoor photography in mountainous terrain. The images were not composites or fabrications. They were genuine photographs of real scenes. The problem was that the scenes didn't match the known geography of the Bitterroot Range. Okonkwo suggested several possibilities. The photographers might have been at a different mountain range entirely, one that bore superficial resemblance to the Bitterroot. But the lookout tower foundation made this unlikely. Perhaps geological changes, landslides, erosion, had altered the terrain significantly between the time the photos were taken and the present day. But such changes would be dramatic and well documented, and there was no record of major geological events at St. Mary Peak. The third possibility, which Okonkwo mentioned reluctantly, was that the photographs depicted an alternate configuration of the landscape, one that existed at some point but no longer matched current conditions. She acknowledged this explanation was speculative and lacked scientific grounding. In December of 2009, Julia Kaplan posted scanned copies of the photographs to an online hiking forum, asking if anyone could identify the hikers or provide context. The post generated significant discussion. Several users claimed to recognize the locations, but noted the same spatial inconsistencies Kaplan and Wolf had observed. One user, a retired Forest Service ranger named Gerald Matsuda, stated that he'd worked in the Bitterroot Range during the 1970s and remembered the St. Mary Peak area looking different from how it appears today. When pressed for details, he said only that the tree line seemed lower and the rock formations less prominent, though he acknowledged this could be faulty memory. Another user, posting under the username Bitterroot Local, claimed to have known people who disappeared while hiking St. Mary Peak in 1976. The user provided no names or details and did not respond to follow-up questions. Kaplan attempted to verify the claim through missing persons records, but found no reports matching the time frame and location. In January of 2010, Kaplan contacted the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office and the Forest Service to report the camera find and inquire about possible missing hikers. The Sheriff's Office reviewed missing persons files from the 1970s and found no cases involving groups of 4 hikers in the St. Mary Peak area. The Forest Service acknowledged the inquiry but stated that records from that era were incomplete and that many incidents were never formally documented. Kaplan then reached out to the Salish Kootenai tribe, hoping that oral history might provide context. A tribal historian, whose name was not disclosed publicly, agreed to view the photographs. The historian noted that the mountain's appearance in the images was consistent with older descriptions passed down through generations, descriptions that predated modern surveying and mapping. The historian stated that the mountain used to look different, but declined to elaborate, citing cultural protocols around discussing sacred sites. In March of 2010, Rachel Okonkwo submitted a brief article to a photographic journal describing the anomalous images. The article presented the technical analysis, noted the inconsistencies, and posed the question of how such photographs could exist. The journal rejected the submission, stating that the work lacked sufficient context and that the phenomena described were more suited to speculative venues than academic publication. Dennis Wolf, frustrated by the lack of progress, decided to hike to St. Mary Peak himself and search for additional clues. On a clear day in May of 2010, he ascended to the location where Kaplan had found the camera case. He searched the area thoroughly, examining the boulder crevice and surrounding terrain. He found no other artifacts, no identification, no indication of who had left the camera or why. Wolf did notice something unusual. The boulder under which the case had been wedged bore a series of shallow scratches on its underside, marks that appeared deliberate, as if someone had carved them. The scratches formed no recognizable pattern or symbols, just irregular lines. Wolf photographed the marks and showed them to a geologist colleague who stated they could be natural weathering or the result of tool marks from hikers or climbers. The marks were inconclusive. In the years following the discovery, several amateur researchers and photography enthusiasts attempted to identify the hikers in the photographs. Facial recognition technology, still rudimentary in 2009, yielded no matches. Comparisons with yearbooks, hiking club records, and other archival sources produced no leads. The individuals in the photographs remained anonymous. One researcher, a librarian named Thomas O'Sullivan, spent months comparing the photographs to historical topographic maps and aerial photographs of the Bitterroot Range. He found that certain features visible in the images, specific rock outcrops, drainage patterns, did exist in the range, but their positions relative to one another were incorrect. It was as if the landscape had been rearranged, with real elements placed in impossible configurations. O'Sullivan's work culminated in a detailed report, which he shared with Kaplan and Wolf. In the report, he stated that the photographs could not depict the Bitterroot Range as it currently exists, or as it existed in any documented historical state. He concluded that either the images had been created through some unknown photographic technique, or they recorded something that defied conventional geographic understanding. The camera case and the original negatives remain in Julia Kaplan's possession. She has declined multiple offers to purchase them, stating that they should stay in the community where they were found. The photographs are occasionally displayed at local historical societies and photography exhibitions, always accompanied by the same questions and the same absence of answers. In 2018, a hiker reported finding a second weathered camera case near St. Mary Peak, in a location roughly half a mile from where Kaplan had found the first. The case was empty. Forest Service personnel were notified, but no investigation was conducted. The empty case was logged as found property and eventually discarded. The four hikers in the photographs, smiling, relaxed, standing in a landscape that almost matches the place they appear to be, have never been identified. No missing persons reports align with their descriptions. No families have come forward. They exist only in those 28 frames, frozen in a version of the Bitterroot Range that no map has ever charted. Julia Kaplan still hikes St. Mary Peak several times each summer. She carries the photographs with her, tucked into a waterproof pouch, and occasionally compares them to the terrain. She says the mountain looks the same as it always has, solid and unchanging. But sometimes, standing at the summit and studying the ridges and rock formations, she sees the shadows fall at angles that almost match the photographs. Almost, but not quite. She says it feels like the mountain is remembering something it's supposed to have forgotten. Some sounds choose their listeners. Sula sits at the southern end of the Bitterroot Valley, a settlement of fewer than 50 permanent residents scattered along the East Fork of the Bitterroot River. The town exists primarily as a supply point for ranchers and a way station for travelers heading south toward the Salmon River country. The surrounding mountains, steep, forested, and largely roadless, contain dozens of abandoned mine workings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when prospectors searched the drainages for copper, silver, and gold. Most of these mines produced little. A few yielded modest profits before economic conditions or depleted ore bodies forced their closure. By the 1930s, nearly all mining activity in the Sula area had ceased. The tunnels were left open, gradually filling with groundwater, collapsing under their own weight, or simply forgotten as vegetation reclaimed the hillsides. The Forest Service conducted surveys of the mines in the 1950s, primarily to assess safety hazards and determine which workings should be sealed or marked with warning signs. One such survey, conducted in the summer of 1954, documented an anomaly that would later be erased from official records. The survey team was led by a mining engineer named Victor Talbot, employed by the Bureau of Mines to assess abandoned workings throughout western Montana. On July 23, 1954, Talbot and two assistants, geologist Franklin Mburu and safety inspector Deanne Kowalski, entered a copper mine approximately 3 miles northeast of Sula, accessible by a deteriorating logging road and a half-mile hike through Douglas fir forest. The mine consisted of a main horizontal tunnel called an adit, extending roughly 400 feet into the hillside, with several short side drifts branching off the main passage. The workings dated to the 1890s, based on tool marks and timber framing styles. The tunnel was dry, structurally sound, and showed no signs of recent disturbance. Approximately 200 feet into the tunnel, Talbot stopped. In his field report, dated July 24th, he wrote, "Perceived low-frequency auditory phenomenon consistent and non-fluctuating. Source undetermined. Duration of observation, 12 minutes. Talbot described the sound as a hum, deep, resonant, just at the threshold of hearing. He estimated the frequency at 60 to 80 hertz, roughly equivalent to the lowest notes on a bass guitar. The sound was not loud, but it was pervasive, seeming to emanate from the rock itself rather than from any specific direction. Talbot noted that the hum did not vary in pitch or intensity, and it continued without interruption for the duration of his time in the tunnel. What made the phenomenon particularly unusual was that only Talbot heard it. Bitterroot and Kowalski, standing beside him in the tunnel, perceived nothing. They listened carefully, moved to different locations, covered their ears, and uncovered them. Silence. Talbot asked them to describe what they heard. They said only the faint drip of water and the sound of their own breathing. Talbot was not prone to hallucination or suggestibility. He'd spent 23 years inspecting mines across the western United States and had encountered many acoustic oddities, echoes, resonances, wind effects. This was different. He could hear it clearly, a continuous low tone that seemed to press against his eardrums. But his colleagues heard nothing. The team exited the tunnel and discussed the observation. Bitterroot suggested that Talbot might be experiencing tinnitus or an auditory illusion caused by pressure changes or low oxygen levels. Talbot acknowledged these possibilities, but noted that he felt no other symptoms, no dizziness, no headache, no difficulty breathing. Kowalski proposed returning to the tunnel to conduct a systematic test, using acoustic monitoring equipment if available. Talbot agreed. They re-entered the mine, this time proceeding slowly and stopping at regular intervals. At each stop, Talbot reported whether he heard the hum. The sound began at approximately 180 feet from the entrance and continued to the end of the accessible tunnel. Bitterroot and Kowalski still heard nothing. They returned to town and borrowed a handheld sound level meter from a local contractor. The device detected ambient noise consistent with an empty tunnel, no unusual frequencies, no low-frequency anomalies. Talbot's report, filed with the Bureau of Mines Regional Office in Butte, Montana, included a section titled Anomalous Auditory Phenomenon. He described the hum, noted its selective audibility, and recommended further investigation. The report was reviewed and filed. No follow-up was ordered. In 1958, a second survey team visited the Sula area as part of a broader assessment of mine hazards. The team included a different set of personnel, none of whom had been involved in the 1954 survey. One member, a structural engineer named Margaret Oluwaseun, entered the same tunnel Talbot had documented. In her field notes, she wrote, "Low hum present at 200 feet depth, continuous, non-directional. No other team members reported hearing." Oluwaseun's notes included a detail Talbot had not mentioned. She wrote that the hum felt purposeful, as if it were conveying information or maintaining a rhythm, though she could not identify any pattern or variation. She described the sensation as unsettling, not because the sound was threatening, but because it seemed aware of her presence. Oluwaseun's report was submitted to the Bureau of Mines. Unlike Talbot's 1954 report, hers was not filed in the standard archive. Requests for the document, made decades later by researchers, were met with the response that no such report existed in Bureau records. Over the following decades, stories about the hum circulated among residents of the Bitterroot Valley, particularly those with family ties to the Sula area. The accounts were consistent. Certain individuals, when entering specific abandoned mines near Sula, heard a low, continuous hum that others could not perceive. The sound was always described in similar terms: deep, steady, patient. No one who heard it felt physically harmed, but many reported a lingering sense of disquiet, as if the sound were waiting for something. In 1973, a folklore graduate student named Kenneth Dela Cruz, studying regional mining culture, interviewed several Bitterroot Valley residents about their experiences with the mines. 3 individuals mentioned the hum. One, a retired rancher named Patricia Novak, said she'd heard it in 1961 while exploring old mine tunnels with her brother. She described it as a sound that knows you're there. Her brother, standing beside her at the time, heard nothing. Another interviewee, a logger named Raymond Vasquez, said he'd entered a mine near Sula in 1968 and heard a hum so pervasive it made his teeth ache. He left the tunnel after less than 5 minutes and never returned. When Dela Cruz asked what he thought caused the sound, Vasquez said he didn't know, but that it felt like something counting down. A third individual, a woman identified in Dela Cruz's notes only as LH, said her grandfather had worked the copper mines near Sula in the 1880s and had mentioned a singing in the stone that followed certain miners but not others. LH said her grandfather believed the sound was territorial, a warning from the mountain that some people were not meant to go deeper. Dela Cruz compiled these accounts into an unpublished manuscript titled Auditory Phenomena in Abandoned Mines of the Bitterroot Range. He submitted the manuscript to a regional history journal. It was rejected with a note from the editor stating that the accounts lacked corroboration and did not meet standards for historical documentation. In 1997, a geophysicist named Dr. Helena Sutherland, researching low-frequency seismic phenomena in the northern Rockies, learned of the Sula hum through informal conversations with local residents. Intrigued, she obtained permission from the Forest Service to conduct acoustic measurements in several abandoned mines near Sula. In August of that year, she entered the same tunnel documented by Talbot in 1954. Sutherland heard the hum. She described it in her field notes as a sustained tone at approximately 70 hertz, non-varying with no identifiable source. She deployed seismographs and acoustic sensors throughout the tunnel, recording data for 6 hours. The instruments detected rhythmic vibrations at low frequencies, consistent with the hum she perceived. But the vibrations were faint, barely above background noise, and could not account for the clarity and intensity of the auditory experience. Sutherland noted something else. The hum seemed to intensify when she moved deeper into the tunnel, reaching peak intensity at approximately 250 feet from the entrance. Beyond that point, it began to fade. She also noted that her research assistant, a graduate student from Seattle, heard nothing at any point during the survey. Sutherland asked the assistant about his background. He said he'd grown up in Washington State, lived briefly in Colorado, and had no family connections to Montana. Sutherland, by contrast, had been born in Missoula and raised in the Bitterroot Valley, less than 40 miles from Sula. She began to wonder if the hum's audibility correlated with geographic origin. She conducted an informal survey asking 12 individuals, 6 born in the Bitterroot Valley, 6 born elsewhere, to enter the tunnel and report what they heard. All 6 Bitterroot natives heard the hum. None of the outsiders did. The correlation was absolute. Sutherland's findings were never formally published. She submitted a preliminary report to a geophysics conference in 1998, but the paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the phenomenon was more likely psychological or cultural than geophysical, and that the selective audibility suggested observer bias rather than measurable acoustic properties. In 2011, the Forest Service installed gates across several abandoned mine entrances near Sula, citing safety concerns and liability issues. The gates were locked and public access was restricted. No public notice explained which mines were closed or why. Local residents noted that the gated mines included the tunnel where the hum had been reported for decades. When questioned, a Forest Service spokesperson stated that the closures were part of routine hazard mitigation and had no connection to any specific incidents or reports. The spokesperson declined to comment on whether acoustic phenomena had been documented at the sites. In 2016, a group of urban explorers attempted to access one of the gated mines. They cut the lock and entered the tunnel with recording equipment, intending to document the interior for a YouTube video. All 3 explorers were from California and had no prior connection to Montana. According to their video, posted online later, they spent 40 minutes inside the tunnel and heard nothing unusual. The video shows empty passages, rusted mining equipment, and standing water. No hum is audible on the recording. The video's comment section included several posts from individuals claiming to be Bitterroot Valley natives. They wrote that the hum would not be audible to outsiders and would not register on recording equipment. One commenter wrote, "It's not for you. It doesn't care that you're there." Dr. Helena Sutherland retired from academic research in 2019. In a final interview with a regional science publication, she was asked about her work on the Sula mines. She said the hum remained the most perplexing phenomenon she'd encountered in her career. She said she believed it was real, measurable, and selective, but that she had no framework to explain it. She also said something that was not included in the published interview, but appeared in the journalist's notes. Sutherland stated that the last time she'd visited the mine, in 2010, the hum had changed. It was faster, she said, as if whatever was counting had less time remaining. The mines near Sula remain gated. The Forest Service does not provide tours or access permits. Locals who grew up in the Bitterroot Valley rarely discuss the hum with outsiders, and when they do, they speak carefully, as if describing something that listens. Some of them say the hum is still there, behind the gates, waiting in the dark. They say it's not hostile, just present, the way a clock is present. They say if you were born in the valley, you'd understand. The sound isn't trying to scare you, it's just marking time until something arrives. Some rescues happen long after the rescuer is gone. Ward Mountain rises to 8,600 feet in a remote section of the Bitterroot Range, approximately 18 miles southwest of Darby, Montana. The mountain is not particularly prominent, overshadowed by higher peaks to the north and south, but its isolation and difficult access make it a challenging destination for backpackers. The area is laced with old logging roads, abandoned trails, and unmaintained paths that appear and disappear beneath decades of forest growth. Navigation requires careful attention to topographic maps and compass work, as GPS signals are unreliable in the steep forested drainages. The Bitterroot National Forest maintains minimal infrastructure in the Ward Mountain area. A few trails are marked on official maps, but their condition varies from passable to entirely overgrown. The Forest Service discourages solo travel in this section of the range, citing navigation difficulty and the remoteness of the terrain. Cell phone coverage is non-existent. Water sources are scarce during late summer. Search and rescue operations, when necessary, are complicated by the lack of roads and the density of the forest. On July 14, 1999, a backpacker named Emily Cosgrove set out on a solo 3-day trip into the Ward Mountain area. Cosgrove was 32 years old, an experienced hiker with several years of backcountry travel in Montana and Idaho. She filed a trip plan with the Forest Service detailing her intended route, campsites, and expected return date of July 17th. Her plan indicated she would hike a loop beginning at the Mill Creek trailhead, ascending to the Ward Mountain Ridge, and returning via an old logging road. Cosgrove did not return on July 17th. Her vehicle remained at the trailhead. When she failed to check in with her emergency contact, a friend in Missoula, by the evening of July 18th, the friend contacted the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office. A search and rescue operation was initiated the following morning. The search team, coordinated by the Forest Service and staffed by volunteer rescuers from the Bitterroot Search and Rescue Group, began at the Mill Creek trailhead and followed Cosgrove's intended route. The trail was faint in places, overgrown with huckleberry bushes and deadfall. Weather had been clear during Cosgrove's trip, with no storms or unusual conditions that might have forced her off course. On the afternoon of July 19th, searchers found evidence of Cosgrove's passage, a scrap of orange flagging tape she'd tied to a branch to mark her route, consistent with standard backcountry practice. The tape was located approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, near a ridge saddle. Searchers called out, sounded whistles, and searched the surrounding area. They found no further sign of Cosgrove. The search continued through July 20th and 21st, expanding to cover drainages and alternate routes she might have taken if disoriented. Helicopters conducted aerial surveys. Ground teams moved through dense timber and across steep slopes, calling and listening. By the evening of July 21st, the search area had expanded to over 20 square miles, and hope was fading. On the morning of July 22nd, searchers received a radio call from a logging road crew working approximately 14 miles northeast of the Mill Creek trailhead near the lower slopes of Ward Mountain. The crew reported encountering a disoriented hiker matching Cosgrove's description. She was walking along an overgrown logging road, alone and exhausted but physically unharmed. Search and rescue personnel reached Cosgrove within an hour. She was dehydrated and fatigued, but coherent. Paramedics evaluated her and found no injuries requiring immediate medical intervention. She was transported to a hospital in Hamilton for observation and released the following day. During initial interviews conducted at the hospital, Cosgrove provided an account of her experience that search coordinators found deeply puzzling. She stated that she had become disoriented on the afternoon of July 15th, the second day of her trip, after leaving the main trail to investigate what she thought was a shortcut. She quickly realized she was lost. Her map and compass indicated she was farther west than intended, in terrain she did not recognize. Cosgrove said she spent the night of July 15th in a makeshift camp, rationing her water and food. On the morning of July 16th, she attempted to navigate back toward the trail, but became further disoriented. She described the forest as unusually dense and the terrain as more rugged than her map suggested. By the afternoon of July 16th, she was out of water and beginning to panic. It was then, she said, that she encountered the ranger. Cosgrove described him as a man in his 50s, wearing a Forest Service uniform, green pants, a tan shirt, and a campaign hat. He approached her calmly, introduced himself, and asked if she needed assistance. She said yes, explaining that she was lost and had been trying to find her way back to the Mill Creek trailhead. The ranger said he knew the area well and could guide her to safety. He gave her water from his canteen and showed her his map, pointing out her location and the route they would take. Cosgrove noticed his name badge. It read R. Holloway. She asked how long he'd been working in the area. He said a long time, longer than most people realized. Over the next day and a half, Holloway led Cosgrove through the forest, following paths she could not see, and navigating terrain with a confidence that suggested intimate familiarity. They did not speak much. Holloway moved steadily, pausing occasionally to check landmarks or adjust their course. He shared his food and water with her. At night, they camped in small clearings. Holloway built no fire, saying it wasn't necessary. On the morning of July 22nd, Holloway told Cosgrove they were close to a logging road where she would find help. He led her to the road, pointed in the direction she should walk, and said someone would be along soon. Cosgrove thanked him. She asked how she could repay him or send a letter of appreciation to the Forest Service. Holloway smiled and said that wouldn't be necessary. He turned and walked back into the forest. Cosgrove watched him go, then started down the road. Within an hour, she encountered the logging crew. Search coordinator Dennis Alvarez conducted a follow-up interview with Cosgrove on July 23rd, after she'd rested and been cleared by medical personnel. Alvarez asked her to describe the ranger in detail. Cosgrove provided a thorough description. Approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, graying hair, weathered face, calm demeanor. She remembered his uniform clearly, vintage in style, with metal buttons and a belt that looked older than modern Forest Service issue. She remembered the name badge, R. Holloway. Alvarez contacted the Bitterroot National Forest Personnel Office and requested information about any ranger named Holloway currently working in the district. The office confirmed that no one by that name was employed by the Forest Service in Montana. Alvarez expanded the search, checking retired personnel and rangers who might have been visiting the area. No matches were found. A week later, Alvarez received an unusual call from a retired Forest Service employee named Margaret Pemberton, who had worked in the Bitterroot district during the 1960s and 70s. Pemberton said she'd heard about the Cosgrove rescue and wanted to share some information. She asked if the ranger's name had been Robert Holloway. Alvarez confirmed it had. Pemberton said she'd known Holloway. He'd been a ranger in the Ward Mountain area from 1948 until 1951, when he transferred to another district. He'd retired in the late 1960s and passed away in 1976. Alvarez was silent for a moment. He asked Pemberton if she was certain about the dates. She said yes, absolutely. Holloway had been a legend in the district, known for his knowledge of the backcountry and his skill in navigating difficult terrain. She said she'd attended his funeral in Missoula in 1976. She still had a photograph of him from a Forest Service picnic in 1967. She offered to send it. The photograph arrived a week later. It showed a man in a Forest Service uniform standing beside a truck, smiling. The uniform was vintage: green pants, tan shirt, campaign hat. The face was weathered, calm, confident. Alvarez showed the photograph to Emily Cosgrove without explanation. She identified the man immediately. That was the ranger who had rescued her, she said. That was R. Holloway. Alvarez filed a supplemental report with the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, documenting Cosgrove's account and the scenes, information provided by Pemberton. The report noted the inconsistency. The ranger Cosgrove described had been dead for 23 years and offered no explanation. Alvarez recommended that the matter be reviewed by Forest Service investigators. No such review was conducted. In August of 1999, a journalist from the Missoulian newspaper contacted Alvarez after hearing rumors about the Cosgrove rescue. Alvarez declined to comment, citing the ongoing nature of search and rescue records. The journalist attempted to interview Cosgrove, who also declined. The story was never published. In 2001, a folklore researcher named Dr. Helena Sutherland, studying regional legends and ghost stories in Montana, learned of the incident through informal conversations with retired Forest Service personnel. She contacted Cosgrove and requested an interview. Cosgrove agreed, on the condition that her full name not be used in any publication. During the interview, Cosgrove reiterated her account. She said she had no doubt that the man who rescued her was real, solid, physical, present. He had given her water, shown her a map, led her through the forest. She said she understood how the story sounded, but that she knew what she had experienced. She said Holloway had saved her life, and she would not dishonor that by pretending it hadn't happened. Sutherland asked if Cosgrove had noticed anything unusual about Holloway, anything that might suggest he was not entirely what he appeared to be. Cosgrove thought for a moment. She said the only thing that struck her as odd was how quiet he was when he walked. Even in dense brush, she never heard his footsteps. She said his uniform looked old-fashioned, but she'd assumed it was simply well-worn or vintage issue. She said he never ate any of the food he shared with her, claiming he wasn't hungry. And she said that when he walked back into the forest on the morning of July 22nd, he didn't look back. He just disappeared into the trees, as if he'd been there 1,000 times before. Sutherland's research was never formally published. She included a brief reference to the incident in an unpublished manuscript on Montana folklore, noting it as an example of crisis apparition, or benevolent encounter, phenomena reported in wilderness settings where lost individuals claim to be guided by figures who later proved to be deceased or non-existent. In 2006, the Forest Service conducted a review of backcountry incidents in the Bitterroot Range, including the Cosgrove Rescue. The review file, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2015, contains Alvarez's original reports and witness statements, but no analysis or conclusion. A final summary page is marked Status Unresolved. Emily Cosgrove moved to Oregon in 2003 and rarely speaks publicly about her experience. In a brief email exchange with a regional hiking forum in 2012, she wrote, "I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I'd believe me, but I know what happened. A ranger guided me out of the forest. His name was Robert Holloway. He was kind and professional, and I owe him my life." Margaret Pemberton, the retired Forest Service employee who identified Holloway from the photograph, passed away in 2009. Her personal papers, donated to the Montana Historical Society, include a folder labeled Ward Mountain Rangers. Inside is a photocopy of Holloway's personnel file showing his service from 1948 to 1951 in the Ward Mountain District. A handwritten note, in Pemberton's writing, reads, "Bob knew those mountains better than anyone. I'm not surprised he's still out there." The Ward Mountain area remains remote and lightly traveled. The Forest Service maintains minimal trail infrastructure, and the terrain continues to challenge even experienced hikers. No other incidents similar to Cosgrove's rescue have been documented, though search and rescue personnel occasionally mention, off the record, that lost hikers in the Ward Mountain area sometimes report encounters with helpful strangers who disappear before they can be thanked. The photograph of Robert Holloway, taken at a Forest Service picnic in 1967, remains in Margaret Pemberton's donated archives. In the image, Holloway stands beside a truck, smiling slightly, wearing his campaign hat and uniform. The mountains are visible in the background, familiar, unchanging, patient. Some rescuers, it seems, never really leave their posts. Some trees grow according to calendars no one can see. Painted Rocks Lake sits at 5,800 feet in a glacial valley on the western slope of the Bitterroot Range, approximately 25 miles south of Darby, Montana. The lake is man-made, created in 1962 by the construction of Painted Rocks Dam, which impounded the West Fork of the Bitterroot River. Before the dam, the valley contained a series of meadows and oxbow channels used by indigenous Salish people for seasonal camps. The surrounding forest, dominated by western larch, lodgepole pine, and Douglas fir, is largely old growth, having escaped the intensive logging that cleared much of the Bitterroot Valley in the early 20th century. Western larch is a deciduous conifer. Unusual among needle-bearing trees in that it sheds its foliage each autumn. The species can live for over 700 years, and its growth rings provide valuable data for climate reconstruction and fire history analysis. Dendrochronology, the science of dating tree rings, relies on the principle that tree growth varies predictably with environmental conditions. Wet years produce wide rings. Dry years produce narrow rings. Stressful conditions, fire, disease, insect infestation, leave distinctive signatures in the wood. The Bitterroot Range has been the subject of numerous dendrochronological studies, as the region's forests contain exceptional old-growth specimens that extend climate records back several centuries. Painted Rocks Lake, in particular, has attracted researchers due to the age and accessibility of its larch stands. In 2007, a dendrochronology team from the University of Montana, led by Dr. Kenneth Navarro, initiated a long-term study of western larch near Painted Rocks Lake. The project aimed to reconstruct fire history and climate variability over the past 400 years. Navarro's team cored dozens of trees, extracting pencil-thin samples from trunks using increment borers. The samples were transported to the university's Tree Ring Laboratory in Missoula for analysis. Initial results were unremarkable. The cores showed expected patterns: wide rings during wet periods, narrow rings during droughts, fire scars corresponding to known historical blazes. But in 2009, a graduate student named Aisha Kowalski, analyzing cores from a cluster of larch near the lake's western shore, noticed something unusual. 3 trees in the cluster, all estimated to be over 350 years old, showed identical ring patterns that repeated at precise intervals. Specifically, rings corresponding to the years 1934, 1977, and 2020 exhibited the same characteristics: extreme narrowness, abnormal density, and dark discoloration. The pattern held across all 3 trees, despite their being spaced 50 to 100 feet apart. Kowalski cross-referenced the years with historical climate data. 1934 had been a drought year in Montana, which could explain narrow rings. But 1977 had been a year of above-average precipitation, and 2020, though not yet reached when the cores were taken, was projected based on ring formation already visible in the outermost layers. The trees were growing as if 2020 would be a stress year, identical to 1934 and 1977, despite no climatic reason for the pattern. Kowalski brought the anomaly to Navarro's attention. He examined the samples under magnification and confirmed her observations. The rings were not only narrow and dark, but showed cellular structures consistent with extreme physiological stress: collapsed vessels, compression wood, resin deposits. The trees had experienced trauma in those years, but the trauma did not correlate with any known environmental factors. Navarro expanded the analysis, examining additional cores from the same stand. He found that the pattern extended beyond the initial 3 trees. 12 of the 15 sampled larch near Painted Rocks Lake showed the same repeating cycle: stress rings in 1934 and 1977, with preliminary evidence suggesting the same would occur in 2020. The interval between events was 43 years. Navarro's team searched for historical records that might explain the pattern. They reviewed fire records, insect outbreak data, weather station logs, and hydrological reports. No events aligned with the 43-year cycle. 1934 had been a drought year, but fires in the area had been minimal. 1977 had seen no fires, no disease outbreaks, no unusual weather. The trees had responded to something invisible, something that left no trace in official records. In 2011, Navarro published a preliminary paper in a regional forestry journal describing the anomalous ring patterns and requesting input from other dendrochronologists. The paper generated limited response. 2 colleagues suggested the patterns might result from localized soil chemistry or groundwater fluctuations. Another proposed that the trees were responding to seismic activity, though no significant earthquakes had been recorded in the area during the relevant years. One respondent, a retired Forest Service ecologist named Margaret Delacroix, sent a private letter to Navarro. She wrote that she had worked in the Painted Rocks area during the 1970s and remembered the summer of 1977 as strange. Trees in certain areas had shed their needles prematurely, she wrote, as if preparing for winter in mid-August. She had filed a report with the Forest Service, but no follow-up investigation had been conducted. She said the incident had troubled her at the time, but she'd assumed it was a localized pathogen or nutrient deficiency. Delacroix's letter included a copy of her original report, dated September 1977, which described unexplained foliar senescence in western larch stands near Painted Rocks Reservoir. Navarro contacted the Forest Service to request access to related reports or studies from 1977. He was told that records from that period had been archived and were not readily accessible. He filed a formal request. Months passed. Eventually, he received a response stating that the requested documents could not be located. In 2013, Navarro returned to Painted Rocks Lake with a larger team, intending to expand the sample size and monitor the trees as 2020 approached. The team cored an additional 30 trees from the western larch stand and several dozen more from surrounding areas. The results were consistent. Trees within a specific zone, roughly a quarter-mile radius from the lake's western shore, showed the 43-year stress cycle. Trees outside this zone showed normal growth patterns. Navarro's team also installed dendrometer bands on 10 trees within the affected zone. Dendrometers measure trunk circumference at fine resolution, recording growth in real time. The goal was to observe whether the trees exhibited unusual behavior as 2020 approached. During the summer of 2014, while processing samples in the laboratory, Aisha Kowalski began experiencing recurring dreams. She described them in her field notes, initially as a curiosity, later with growing unease. The dreams were always the same. She stood in the larch forest near Painted Rocks Lake, surrounded by the trees. It was autumn, the needles golden and beginning to fall. She was counting backward from 43. The numbers descended slowly, rhythmically. When she reached 0, she woke. Kowalski mentioned the dreams to a colleague, Dr. Raymond Oluwaseun, who was also working on the Painted Rocks project. Oluwaseun said he'd been having similar dreams, standing in the forest, counting backward, unable to stop. He said the dreams had started after he'd spent a day examining core samples under a microscope. Navarro, when informed of the dreams, initially dismissed them as coincidence or stress-related. But over the following months, 3 other team members reported similar experiences. All described the same setting, the same action, standing among the larch, counting backward from 43. None could explain why 43. None knew what happened when the count reached 0. In 2016, Navarro submitted a more detailed paper to a peer-reviewed dendrochronology journal, including the expanded data set and the precise boundaries of the affected zone. The paper noted the 43-year cycle, the lack of environmental correlation, and the localized nature of the phenomenon. It did not mention the dreams. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the patterns, while unusual, were likely the result of localized soil conditions or mycorrhizal networks that had not been adequately investigated. One reviewer suggested that the authors were engaging in pattern-seeking behavior and recommended additional controls before resubmission. Navarro was frustrated but undeterred. He continued monitoring the dendrometer data and planned to intensify observations as 2020 approached. In 2018, the dendrometers began recording anomalies. Tree growth, which should have slowed during late summer, accelerated briefly before stopping entirely in early September. The pattern was identical across all 10 monitored trees. Trunk circumference increased by an average of 2 millimeters over 3 days, then ceased growing for the remainder of the season. Navarro could find no explanation. The weather had been mild, soil moisture adequate, no signs of disease or insect activity. The trees had simply stopped growing, as if in response to a signal. In January of 2020, Navarro received an email from a researcher in Norway, Dr. Ingrid Sorensen, who had read his rejected paper through informal academic networks. Sorensen wrote that she had encountered similar phenomena in Scandinavian pine forests, growth rings that repeated at regular intervals despite varying climate conditions. She said the affected trees were always clustered in specific locations, often near ancient cultural sites or areas with long histories of human habitation. She suggested that the trees might be responding to something other than environmental stress, something rhythmic, cyclical, and unexplained. Sorensen's email included a troubling postscript. She wrote that several researchers who had studied the Norwegian trees reported persistent dreams of counting always backward, always ending at zero. She said she had experienced the dreams herself and had stopped working on the project as a result. Navarro did not respond to the email. He told colleagues that he intended to visit Painted Rocks Lake in the summer of 2020 to observe the trees directly during what he predicted would be another stress event. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted his plans. Field research was suspended. Navarro worked from home, analyzing existing data, but could not return to the site. In August of 2020, a Forest Service ranger named Patricia Vasquez, conducting routine patrols near Painted Rocks Lake, noticed that a section of the western larch forest had shed its needles prematurely. The trees were bare, their branches skeletal, standing against the summer sky like burned snags. Vasquez photographed the area and filed a report with the district office. The report noted that the trees appeared stressed, but showed no signs of fire, disease, or insect damage. Vasquez's report was forwarded to the Forest Health Protection Program, which dispatched a technician to investigate in September. The technician found that the affected trees had begun producing new needle growth, suggesting they had not died but had experienced a temporary dormancy. Samples were collected for analysis. The results indicated no pathogens, no chemical contamination, no clear cause for the premature needle shed. Kenneth Navarro learned of the incident through informal contacts and requested copies of the Forest Service reports. His request was acknowledged but not fulfilled. In 2021, he attempted to visit Painted Rocks Lake to collect new core samples. Access was restricted due to ongoing wildfire activity in the region. He did not return. In 2022, Navarro retired from the University of Montana. His final published work made no mention of the Painted Rocks larch or the 43-year cycle. In a private conversation with a colleague, recorded in an unpublished oral history project, Navarro said he believed the trees were responding to something that human instruments could not measure, something that recurred with inhuman precision, marking time in a way that transcended climate or biology. He also said that he still had the dreams. He said they had intensified after 2020, as if the count had reset. He said he was now counting backward from 43 again, night after night, and that he did not know what would happen when he reached zero. Aisha Kowalski left academic research in 2023 and now works in environmental consulting. She does not discuss the Painted Rocks project publicly. In a brief email exchange in 2024, she wrote only, "The trees remember something we've forgotten. I don't think we're supposed to know what it is." The larch forest near Painted Rocks Lake remains accessible to hikers and campers. The trees stand as they always have, their rings recording seasons, decades, centuries. Somewhere in their wood, hidden within the cellular architecture, is a count that continues regardless of weather, regardless of fire, regardless of human observation. 43 years, then something the trees remember, then 43 years again. The next cycle will complete in 2063.